Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Nightmare Narratives. I can picture some of you already in bed, maybe some of you just getting home from work. Wherever you are, whatever time it is, I'm glad you're here. If this helps you relax or sleep, please like and subscribe. It means a lot. Now let's get you comfortable, and I'll tell you tonight's story. My name is Jerry Whitmore, and I've been a park ranger for 16 years. In all that time, I've pulled 127 people out of bad situations in these mountains. Lost hikers, injured climbers, folks who thought they knew the wilderness better than they did. I always brought them home safe. Until Dismal Hollow. People ask me why I don't work the backcountry anymore. Why I took a desk job when I used to live for those rescue calls. They see my hands shake when I try to drink my morning coffee. Notice how I jump at loud noises. Some think it's just age catching up with me. I'm 41, not exactly old, but the mountains can wear a man down. The truth is different. The truth is, I heard my dead son calling for help from a place where no living child had walked in 50 years. It started on a cold October morning in 1987, the kind of day where fog hangs thick in the valleys and doesn't burn off till noon. I was checking my gear at the ranger station when the call came in. 4 people missing from Virginia Tech, Dr. Margaret Fuller, and 3 graduate students. They were doing some kind of research project in Dismal Hollow, studying what the locals call ghost sounds. The hollow sits about 12 miles from the nearest road, deep in the Jefferson National Forest. It's an 8-mile valley that cuts through the mountains like a wound that never healed. The Cherokee who lived here first called it Nevi Giduv, the place of screaming. White settlers renamed it Dismal Hollow, which isn't much better, if you ask me. My grandmother was part Cherokee, and she told me stories about that place when I was young. How children's voices echo up from the rocks, laughing and playing games that no living kids are playing. How families would hear their dead babies crying in the night. I always figured it was just old mountain tales, the kind every hollow has. I should have listened to those stories. The missing research team had been studying what they called phantom sound phenomena. For over 100 years, people had reported hearing children in that hollow, laughing, screaming, calling for help. Dr. Fuller wanted to record these sounds and figure out what caused them. Maybe it was wind through the caves, or the way sound bounced off the limestone cliffs. She was a scientist. She needed logical answers. I loaded my pack with the usual gear, rope, first aid kit, emergency food, sleeping bag, flares, added some cave rescue equipment since Dismal Hollow has a lot of underground passages. My radio worked fine at the station, but I knew it would be mostly useless once I got deep into the hollow. Something about the iron ore deposits messes with electronics. The drive to the trailhead took 2 hours on winding mountain roads. The whole time, I kept thinking about my son Tommy. He died 3 years earlier in a climbing accident out in Colorado. 18 years old, fell from a cliff face while I was teaching him to rappel. My fault for taking him on a route too hard for his skill level. My fault for not double-checking his gear. My fault for letting him go first. I tried not to think about Tommy when I was working. It made my hands unsteady, my judgment cloudy. But something about this call made me remember his voice, the way he'd shout, "Dad, watch this," before trying something that scared me half to death. The fog was thick when I reached the hollow's mouth. Thick enough that my flashlight beam seemed to bend and twist in strange ways. The temperature dropped 15 degrees the moment I stepped past the tree line, like walking into a refrigerator. My breath came out in white puffs, which was odd for October in Virginia. Birds should have been everywhere. Instead, I heard nothing. Not one chirp, not one wing beat. Just silence so complete it made my ears ring. I found their camp about 2 miles in. 4 tents arranged in a neat square, a fire ring with cold ashes, recording equipment set up on a folding table. Everything looked normal except for 2 things. Coffee was still warm in the pot, and all 4 sleeping bags were empty but still zipped up tight, like they'd vanished right out of their beds. I called out their names. "Dr. Fuller, this is Ranger Whitmore." My voice echoed off the hollow walls in a way that didn't sound right. Instead of one echo, I heard 3 or 4, all coming from different directions. Like the rocks were playing my words back to me in pieces. The recording equipment was still running. I hit playback and listened to hours of static broken up by strange sounds, clicking, tapping, what might have been whispers. Then I heard something that made my skin crawl. Clear as day, a child's voice saying, "Come, play with us." I rewound the tape and played it again. Same voice, same words. But Dr. Fuller's notes said they'd been alone in the hollow for 3 days. No families camping, no day hikers. The nearest road was 12 miles away through rough terrain. Where had that child come from? I checked my compass. The needle spun like a broken clock, never settling on any direction. My GPS unit showed nothing but static. Radio was just high-pitched whining that hurt my ears. I was on my own. Following their trail wasn't hard at first. 4 sets of adult footprints in the soft earth, heading deeper into the hollow. Dr. Fuller wore size 6 hiking boots. The grad students, 2 men, 1 woman, according to the missing person report, left clear tracks in their expensive trail shoes. The path led toward the limestone cliffs that formed the hollow's back wall. Local maps showed cave systems there, some of them pretty extensive. Maybe the research team had decided to investigate the caves where the phantom sounds seemed loudest. I followed the trail for about a mile before I noticed something wrong. 4 sets of tracks going in, but only 3 coming back out. And the 3 that returned weren't heading back to camp. They angled off toward the north wall of the hollow, toward a section I knew was just solid rock. The 4th trail, Dr. Fuller's small boots, simply ended at the base of a limestone cliff. Not like she'd turned around or climbed up. The tracks just stopped, like she'd walked straight into the stone and disappeared. I examined the cliff face carefully. Solid rock, no openings, no crevices large enough for a person to squeeze through. But her tracks led right to that spot and vanished. That's when I heard the first scream. It came from above me, echoing down from the cliff tops. A child's voice, high and terrified, calling for help. I looked up but saw nothing except gray rock and gray sky. The scream came again, then again, each time from a different direction. North, south, east, like multiple children were scattered around the hollow, all in trouble at once. I started climbing toward the sound, using my rope to scale the easier sections. The limestone was slick with moisture, treacherous in the cold air. But I'd done technical rescues before. If kids were trapped up there, I'd find them. Halfway up the cliff, I found Sarah Kim, one of the grad students. She was wedged in a narrow chimney between 2 rock faces, about 40 feet off the ground. At first I thought she was dead. Her eyes were open but didn't track when I called her name. She was breathing, though, shallow and fast, like she was having a nightmare. Getting her out took 2 hours of careful rope work. She was hypothermic, dehydrated, but alive. When I finally got her down and wrapped in an emergency blanket, she grabbed my arm with surprising strength. "Don't let them take me back," she whispered. "The children want me to play their games forever." I asked her what happened to Dr. Fuller and the other 2 students. Sarah just stared at me with wide, frightened eyes. "They're still playing," she said. "In the deep caves, with the dead children who never got to grow up." I figured hypothermia was making her talk crazy. Cold does funny things to the brain. But when I tried to radio for medical evacuation, something impossible happened. My radio crackled to life with a clear signal. Not the base station, though. Instead, I heard my son Tommy's voice, as clear as if he was standing right next to me. "Dad, Dad, I'm hurt. I need help. I'm in the cave. Dad, why won't you come find me?" I nearly dropped the radio. Tommy had been dead for 3 years, buried in a cemetery 200 miles away. But that was his voice, no doubt about it. Same tone, same way he said "Dad" when he was scared. Sarah was watching me with those wide eyes. "You hear them too now, don't you?" she said. "That's how it starts. First you hear your dead calling, then you go to find them, then you stay forever." The voice came again through the radio static. "Please, Dad, I'm so cold. I'm in the dark and I can't find my way out. Help me." Every parent knows their child's voice. This was Tommy, somehow calling to me from whatever lay beyond death. My rational mind said it was impossible. My heart said my boy needed help. That's when I made the biggest mistake of my life. I decided to go deeper into the hollow and find out what was really happening in those caves. I should have carried Sarah out right then and called for backup. Should have sealed off the whole area and let someone else investigate. But I heard my dead son calling for help, and nothing else mattered. I made Sarah as comfortable as possible and gave her my emergency beacon. If I didn't come back, she could signal for help. Then I gathered my cave gear and headed toward the sound of my son's voice. The main cave entrance was hidden behind a curtain of hanging moss, about 6 feet wide and tall enough to walk through without ducking. My flashlight beam seemed weak in the darkness, like the cave was swallowing the light. Tommy's voice echoed from deep inside. "This way, Dad. I'm down here." I followed a narrow passage that sloped steadily downward. The limestone walls were slick with condensation, and my breath came out in white puffs. After about 50 yards, the passage opened into a large chamber with a pool of black water at the center. That's where I found grad student Michael Chen. He was floating face down in the pool, which the map said was only 6 feet deep. But when I waded in to pull him out, I couldn't find the bottom. The water just kept going down, deeper and deeper, until my rope ran out at 40 feet. Michael was dead. Had been for at least a day. But here's the thing that still gives me nightmares. There wasn't a mark on him. No injuries, no signs of drowning. He looked peaceful, like he'd just decided to take a nap underwater. I dragged him to the shore and tried CPR anyway. That's when I heard the children laughing. It started as giggles echoing from the chamber walls, like kids playing hide and seek. Then more voices joined in, dozens of them, all children but from different time periods. Some sounded like they were speaking old-fashioned English. Others used words I didn't recognize, maybe Cherokee. I spun around with my flashlight, looking for the source of the laughter. The beam caught something that made my blood freeze. Children's footprints in the mud around the pool. Dozens of them, all different sizes, all bare feet. Some looked fresh. Others seemed worn and faded, like they'd been there for years. But there were no children in the cave, just me and Michael's body and the sound of phantom kids playing games in the dark. Tommy's voice called again, fainter now. "Dad, I'm further down, in the deep place, please come find me." Against every instinct I had, I left Michael's body and followed the voice deeper into the cave system. The passages branched and twisted, leading me through chambers filled with strange rock formations. Limestone pillars that looked like twisted trees, flowstone that resembled frozen waterfalls, and everywhere, children's voices. Calling, laughing, singing old songs I almost remembered from my grandmother's stories. In the third chamber, I found Dr. Fuller. She was sitting cross-legged in the center of the room, staring at the cave wall. Her expensive outdoor gear was soaked through, and ice crystals had formed in her hair. But she was breathing. "Dr. Fuller," I called, "it's Ranger Whitmore. I'm here to help." She turned to look at me, and I saw something in her eyes that wasn't quite human anymore, like she was seeing things that weren't there. Or maybe seeing things that were there but shouldn't be. "They're so beautiful," she whispered. "The children. They've been waiting so long for someone to play with them. They don't understand why everyone always runs away." I moved closer, keeping my flashlight trained on her face. "Dr. Fuller, you're hypothermic. We need to get you out of here." She laughed, and it sounded like the phantom children's laughter echoing around us. "You can't leave once they choose you. They chose me. They chose Michael and David and Sarah. And now they're choosing you." "Where's David?" I asked. The last grad student was still missing. Dr. Fuller pointed deeper into the cave. "He went to play the finding game. They hide, and you seek. But the rules are different here. Time works differently. Some of the children have been hiding for 200 years. That's when I understood what I was dealing with. This wasn't just some natural acoustic phenomenon. The hollow was haunted. Really, genuinely haunted, by the spirits of children who died there over the centuries. The Cherokee Place of Screaming wasn't just a scary name. It was a warning. Tommy's voice drifted up from a narrow passage to my left. "Dad, I'm here. In the deep dark. Come find me." Dr. Fuller was watching me with those strange eyes. "He's not your son," she said, "but he could be. They can be whatever you need them to be. Whatever loss you're carrying. They just want someone to play with forever." I knew she was right. Tommy was buried in Colorado, 3 years dead. But the voice was so perfect, so exactly like my boy when he was scared and needed his dad. How could I not follow? I made myself turn away from the passage where Tommy's voice was calling. Instead, I picked up Dr. Fuller and started carrying her toward the entrance. She fought me at first, saying the children would be angry if she left them alone again. But as we got closer to daylight, she seemed to come back to herself. The strange look left her eyes, replaced by confusion and terror. "Oh God," she whispered, "what happened to us down there? What were those things?" I was about to answer when we heard screaming from outside the cave. Real screaming, from a living person. Sarah was under attack. I ran toward Sarah's screams, leaving Dr. Fuller by the cave entrance. What I saw when I reached the spot where I'd left the grad student made me question everything I thought I knew about reality. Sarah was surrounded by children. Not phantom voices or mysterious footprints. Sarah, actual children, translucent but clearly visible in the gray afternoon light. There were dozens of them, ranging in age from maybe 5 to 15. Some wore old-fashioned clothes from a century ago. Others were dressed in buckskin and feathers. A few looked like they might have been wearing 1,930 seconds work clothes. They were all holding hands in a circle around Sarah, dancing and singing in voices that sounded like wind through dead leaves. Sarah was in the center, spinning slowly with her arms outstretched, laughing with an expression of pure joy on her face. But her eyes were wrong, empty, like something else was looking out through them. "Sarah," I shouted. "Sarah, snap out of it." The children stopped dancing and turned to look at me. Their faces were beautiful and terrible at the same time. Perfect features, marred by the gray pallor of death. When they spoke, their voices overlapped like a chorus. "She's playing with us now," they said. "She doesn't want to leave." None of the grown-ups ever want to leave once they remember how to play. I pulled out my emergency flare and popped it. Brilliant red light flooded the hollow, and the phantom children scattered like smoke. Sarah collapsed, unconscious but breathing. That's when Tommy stepped out from behind a tree. He looked exactly like he had the day he died. 18 years old, wearing his favorite climbing gear, that crooked smile on his face that always meant he was about to try something dangerous. But his skin had the same gray pallor as the other phantom children. "Hey Dad," he said, and his voice was warm and real, and exactly like I remembered. "I've been waiting for you. We've all been waiting." Every rational part of my mind knew this wasn't my son. Tommy was dead. I'd seen his body, attended his funeral, visited his grave, but the emotional part, the part that still blamed itself for his death, wanted so badly to believe. "You're not Tommy," I said, though my voice cracked saying it. He tilted his head in that familiar way. "I'm as much Tommy as you need me to be. All your memories of me, all your love, all your guilt. I can take that pain away, Dad. We can climb together forever here. You'll never have to worry about me falling again." More phantom children emerged from the trees. I realized they weren't random spirits. Each one represented someone's loss. A parent's dead child, a sibling who died young, a friend taken too soon. The hollow somehow fed on grief, creating perfect replicas of the people we'd lost. "This is what happened to Dr. Fuller's team," I said, understanding finally flooding through me. "They came here to study phantom sounds, but the sounds studied them back. Found their losses, their grief, and used it against them." Tommy nodded. "Michael's little sister drowned when he was 12. He never forgave himself for not watching her more carefully. David lost his twin brother in a car accident. Sarah had a baby that died of SIDS. Dr. Fuller." He paused, smiling that terrible, beautiful smile. "Dr. Fuller lost her own son in a climbing accident. Just like you lost me." The hollow had chosen its victims perfectly. 4 people, all carrying the weight of a child's death, all vulnerable to the promise of reunion. "The Cherokee were right to call this a place of screaming," Tommy continued. "But not because of the dead. Because of the living who come here and scream when they realize they have to choose. Let go of their grief, or stay forever trapped by it." I looked at Sarah, unconscious in the dirt. At Dr. Fuller, stumbling out of the cave. At my phantom son, offering me everything I'd ever wanted and could never have. What about the others? Michael, David? Tommy's expression grew sad. They made their choice. They're with their lost ones now, playing in the deep places where time doesn't matter. They're happy, Dad. Happier than they ever were in the living world. I thought about it. 3 years of guilt, 3 years of wishing I could go back and save him. The phantom Tommy was offering to end all that pain. But he wasn't really offering to end it. He was offering to make it permanent. "No," I said, raising another flare. "I love my son, but you're not him. You're just my guilt wearing his face." The phantom Tommy's expression twisted with rage. "Then you choose to suffer forever." The temperature plummeted. Ice formed on the trees around us. The phantom children returned, dozens of them now, all the young victims of Dismal Hollow's 200-year history. They reached for me with translucent hands, and where they touched, my skin burned with cold. I lit flare after flare, creating a circle of red light. The spirits couldn't cross into the bright glow, but they pressed against it like moths against glass. "Dad, please," the thing wearing Tommy's face pleaded. "I'm so alone here. I need you." That almost broke me. But I remembered what my Cherokee grandmother had taught me about spirits who fed on sorrow. The only way to defeat them was to let go of what they were feeding on. "I love you, Tommy," I said to the phantom. "I loved my real son, but I forgive myself for his death. It was an accident, not my fault. And I choose to live with that truth, instead of hiding in beautiful lies." The phantom children shrieked like wind through a graveyard. One by one, they faded until only the false Tommy remained. "You could have had forever," he said. "Forever isn't worth it if it's not real," I replied. He smiled one last time, and for just a moment, looked like my real son instead of a hungry ghost. Then he was gone. I carried Sarah out of the hollow while Dr. Fuller stumbled behind us, muttering about children who shouldn't exist. It took us 6 hours to reach the trailhead, and by then, my hair had gone completely gray from shock and cold. The official report blamed natural gas leaks for the hallucinations and hypothermia. Michael Chen and David Park were listed as missing, presumed dead in an underground river system. The National Forest Service closed Dismal Hollow indefinitely, citing geological instability. 3 people went into those caves and never came out. But I know the truth. They're still there, playing eternal games with phantom children in chambers where time doesn't work the way it should. Part of me envies them. They got to keep their illusions. I took a desk job after that. Couldn't handle the backcountry anymore. Couldn't trust my own judgment when it came to mysterious disappearances. My hands shake when I try to drink coffee. I jump at sudden noises. But I'm alive, and I'm sane, and I remember the difference between loving someone and being consumed by grief. Sarah recovered physically but never talks about what happened. She changed majors from geology to art therapy, works with children who've experienced trauma. Dr. Fuller published one paper about psychogeological phenomena, then retired from academia. We don't stay in touch. The hollow is still there, still calling to people who've lost children, still offering beautiful reunions that last forever. I monitor the missing person reports from that area, try to warn people away when I can, but grief makes people stupid, makes them ignore warnings from rangers who don't understand what it's like. Sometimes, late at night when I'm alone, I still hear Tommy calling for me. Not the phantom version, my real son's voice, carried on memory and love, instead of supernatural hunger. The difference is subtle but important. I've learned to live with missing him instead of being destroyed by it. That's what the hollow couldn't understand. Grief isn't something to be cured or escaped. It's something to be carried, acknowledged, and slowly transformed into something bearable. If you're ever hiking in the Appalachians and you hear voices of loved ones calling from where they couldn't possibly be, run. Don't investigate. Don't think you can handle whatever's down there. Don't believe the beautiful lies that hungry places tell. I made it out because I chose reality over fantasy, truth over comfort. Most people aren't strong enough to make that choice when faced with the chance to undo their worst losses. The hollow is patient. It's been waiting for 200 years. It can wait 200 more. But it's always listening for the sound of grief calling back. And sometimes, on very quiet nights, I swear I can hear it screaming back. My name is Caleb Ironwood, but everyone just calls me Cal. I've been a park ranger for 19 years now, working the rough country of West Virginia's Monongahela National Forest. Most folks think ranger work is all about helping lost hikers and putting out campfires. But when you're assigned to places like Black Damp Ridge, your job gets a whole lot darker. I specialize in what they call industrial heritage site preservation. Sounds fancy, right? What it really means is I spend my days making sure old mining sites don't kill anybody. West Virginia is full of holes in the ground where men used to dig coal, and most of those holes are still hungry. The Hartwell Mining Complex sits 18 miles from the nearest town, deep in mountains that cell phones can't reach. It's a scarred piece of land with 147 mine shafts, some dating back to 1,000 890. The company shut down operations in 1978, but the mountain remembers everything. 312 men died in these tunnels over the years. The worst was in 1943 when a methane explosion took 23 souls in one terrible moment. My grandfather was one of them. That's why I never believed in mining ghosts. I figured if dead miners were hanging around anywhere, Grandpa would have found a way to let me know. But that was before November 1994, before the first hard freeze, before I saw the shift change in a mine that closed 16 years ago. It started when the college boys from West Virginia University came up to do their geological survey. Dr. Maria Santos led a 3-person team doing routine readings on the sealed shafts. Should have been simple work. Check air quality, test for ground stability, make sure the old tunnels weren't leaking anything nasty into the water table. But their equipment started acting crazy. Gas detectors showing methane readings in areas that had been flooded since Carter was president. Heat signatures coming from shafts that were supposed to be cold and dead. Dr. Santos called our office on a Tuesday afternoon, voice tight with confusion. Ranger Ironwood, we're getting impossible readings here. Equipment's showing active mining in shaft number 7, but that shaft was sealed and flooded in 1978. I told her to pack up and come back Wednesday. Old mining equipment sometimes gives false readings. Mineral deposits in the rock can mess with electronic gear. But Wednesday morning came and went with no sign of the university team. I loaded my truck with mine safety gear, gas detectors, emergency oxygen, rope rescue equipment, and enough industrial flashlights to light up a football field. The drive up to Hartwell takes an hour on good roads. In November, with ice forming on the mountain passes, it took me closer to 2. The abandoned mining complex looks like a battlefield. Acid mine drainage has stained the rocks orange and red. The ground is unstable from all the tunnels underneath. Most of the shaft entrances are sealed with concrete and steel, but you can still see the dark mouths of the mines that haven't been properly closed yet. I found the university team's vehicle parked outside mine shaft number 7. All their equipment was stacked neatly beside the truck. Expensive instruments worth more than my annual salary, just sitting there in the cold. But no sign of Dr. Santos or her 2 graduate students. That's when I heard it for the first time. A sound like pickaxes hitting coal, echoing up from the sealed shaft. The concrete plug had been in place for 16 years, but the sound was coming from behind it, deep underground. I checked my watch. 2 p.m. exactly. Shift change time. The sound stopped as suddenly as it started, but the silence that followed was worse than any noise. It felt like the mountain was holding its breath, waiting for something I didn't understand yet. I set up my equipment and started testing air quality around the sealed entrance. My detector immediately started screaming. Methane and carbon monoxide readings that should have been impossible. The shaft had been flooded and sealed. There shouldn't be any gases at all, let alone the kind that kill miners. But there they were, seeping through solid concrete like the mountain itself was bleeding poison. I radioed headquarters, but the mountains swallow radio signals like they swallow men. I was on my own with 3 missing people and readings that made no sense. The smart thing would have been to leave, come back with a full team and better equipment. But I've never been accused of being smart, and somewhere down in that darkness, 3 people might be running out of air. The temperature was dropping fast as the sun got low behind the ridgeline. Ice was forming at the mine entrances, and the wind through the shaft openings made sounds like voices calling from far away. I've heard that sound 1,000 times in my years working these mountains. Usually, it's just air moving through rock. Usually. But as I stood there in the growing darkness, listening to the mountain sing its cold song, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was different this time. Something was wrong with Hartwell Mining Complex. Wrong in a way that made my grandfather's old mining helmet, sitting on my truck's dashboard, seem to glow in the last light of day. I should have left then. Should have called for backup and come back in the morning with a full rescue team. But when you've spent 19 years pulling people out of places that want to kill them, you develop instincts about these things. And my instincts were screaming that Dr. Santos and her students didn't have until morning. I spent the next 2 hours setting up a safe perimeter around the mine entrances, following protocols I could do in my sleep, test every shaft opening for gas leaks, check structural integrity of the ground, establish communication points, create exit strategies in case things go bad. But everything was wrong from the start. My flashlight beam kept dimming whenever I pointed it directly at mine shaft. Number 7, like the darkness inside was thick enough to swallow light. The taste of coal dust hung in the air, sharp and bitter on my tongue, even though no mining had happened here since before I started high school. At 6 p.m., I heard the whistle. Not a bird call or wind through the rocks, a mine whistle, the kind they used to blow for shift changes back in the day. 3 long blasts echoing from multiple shafts at once, even the ones that were sealed tight. I checked my watch and felt my skin crawl. 6 o'clock. Evening shift change, just like when the mines were running. I tried to tell myself it was just the wind, but the sound was too precise, too human, and it came from underground, from places where no one should be able to make any sound at all. That's when I found the tracks. Fresh mining cart tracks in the mud outside shaft number 12, which had been sealed since 1976. The tracks led right up to the concrete barrier and stopped, like someone had wheeled a cart full of coal right into solid stone. But that wasn't the weird part. The weird part was how fresh they looked, cut deep into mud that had been frozen solid until this afternoon. I knelt down and touched one of the track marks. The edges were sharp and clean, like they'd been made minutes ago, not decades. My radio crackled to life, static-filled and broken. Through the interference, I could swear I heard voices speaking in heavy mountain accents, talking about tonnage and shift quotas and a cave-in in number 7. But when I tried to respond, the voices cut out, leaving nothing but dead air. I decided to check the abandoned mine office, a concrete building that sat halfway between the parking area and the shaft entrances. Maybe the university team had taken shelter there when their equipment started acting up. The office door was unlocked, which was strange since I keep all the buildings secured. Inside, everything was covered in a thick layer of dust, except for one spot. Someone had been sitting at the old supervisor's desk recently, a clear outline in the dust where papers had been moved, where someone had rested their arms while writing. On the desk, I found a time card. It was yellowed and brittle, the kind they used in the 1,940 seconds. But the ink was fresh, and the signature at the bottom made my blood run cold. J. Ironwood, shaft foreman. My grandfather's name. Written in his handwriting, which I recognized from old birthday cards and letters. But my grandfather had been dead for 51 years. I stuffed the time card in my jacket pocket and got out of that office fast. But as I stepped outside, I heard something that made me freeze in place. The sound of pickaxes hitting coal, rhythmic and steady, coming from shaft number 7. The shaft that was sealed, the shaft that was flooded, the shaft where Dr. Santos and her team had been taking readings when they disappeared. I grabbed my heavy-duty flashlight and walked over to the concrete barrier. The sounds were definitely coming from behind it, along with something else. The scrape of shovels, the creak of wooden support beams, and voices. Men talking in low, tired voices about the work they were doing. I pressed my ear against the concrete. The voices got clearer. "Jimmy, get that cart moved. We got quota to make. Seam's running thin here, boss. Might have to go deeper. Air's getting bad. We need more ventilation." Normal mining talk, except for one problem. These men were supposed to be dead. My gas detector started screaming again. I looked at the readings and felt my stomach drop. Carbon monoxide levels were spiking, but they were coming from the other side of the concrete. Somehow, gas from an active mining operation was seeping through a barrier that should have been airtight. That's when I found Dr. Santos. She was sitting on the ground about 50 yards from shaft number 7, back against a tree, looking like she was taking a rest break. But something was wrong with her breathing. Each breath came with a wet, rattling sound that I recognized from my grandfather's stories about black lung disease. "Dr. Santos?" I called out as I approached. "Are you okay?" She looked up at me with eyes that were way too old for her face. When she spoke, her voice was rough and strained, like she'd been breathing coal dust for decades instead of days. Can't stop working," she wheezed. "Foreman says, quota not met, shifts not over." She held up her hands. They were black with coal dust, nails broken and bleeding from digging. But the scary part was her eyes. They looked past me, focused on something I couldn't see. "Where are the other members of your team?" I asked. "Down below," she said, pointing toward the sealed mine entrance. "Shift started Monday. Got to finish the work." Dr. Santos had been missing for 3 days. But she was talking like she'd been working underground for weeks. The black lung symptoms that were killing her breath should have taken years to develop, not hours. I tried to help her stand, but she pulled away. "Can't leave," she said. "Whistle hasn't blown. Shift's not over." And then, as if summoned by her words, the mine whistle blew again. 3 long blasts from underground, from shafts that had been silent for 16 years. But this time, I saw something that made my rational mind start cracking apart. Figures in mining gear walking toward the shaft entrances, translucent like heat shimmer on a summer day, but clearly human-shaped. They carried pickaxes and lunch pails, wore the kind of hard hats they used in the 1942nd, and moved with the tired, steady pace of men heading to work. They walked right through the concrete barriers like the SEALs weren't even there. And at the front of the group, leading them into the darkness, was a man who looked exactly like the pictures of my grandfather. I got Dr. Santos back to my truck and called for medical evacuation, though I knew no helicopter could reach us in this weather. She kept mumbling about shift quotas and cave-ins, her breathing getting worse by the hour. The coal dust in her lungs was real. Whatever had happened to her down in those sealed mines, it was killing her slowly. While I waited for backup, I tried to piece together what was happening. The university team had come to take geological readings. Something about their equipment had detected impossible activity in the sealed shafts. Now 1 team member was dying from black lung disease, and 2 more were missing. At 10 p.m., the whistle blew again. This time I was ready for it. I positioned myself where I could see multiple shaft entrances and waited. The figures appeared right on schedule, dozens of them, emerging from the darkness between the trees and walking purposefully toward the mines. But they weren't heading down into the shafts. They were coming up from them. The phantom miners moved with the exhausted shuffle of men ending a hard shift. Their clothes were dirty, their faces streaked with coal dust and sweat. Some carried empty lunch pails. Others had tools slung over their shoulders. They looked as real as anyone I'd ever seen, except for the way they glowed faintly in the darkness. And they were all looking at me. The group stopped about 20 yards from my truck. Their leader, the man who looked like my grandfather, stepped forward and tipped his hard hat. "Evening, Cal," he said in a voice like gravel in a bucket. "Been waiting for you to come around." "You're dead," I said, "because sometimes the truth is all you've got left." "Dead's a relative term down in the mines," he replied. "We got work to finish. Always got work to finish." "The university students, where are they?" "Down below, where the coal is, learning the trade." His eyes, my grandfather's eyes, were sad but determined. Good workers are hard to find these days. But we always got room for more. That's when State Mine Safety Inspector Harold Daniels showed up. Hank pulled his truck up next to mine, emergency lights flashing, loaded down with specialized gas detection equipment and rescue gear. He was a good man, someone I'd worked with on a dozen mine emergencies over the years. But when he got out of his truck, the phantom miners were gone. Vanished like they'd never been there at all. "Cal, what's the situation?" Hank asked. "All business." I tried to explain about the university team, about the impossible gas readings, about Dr. Santos and her black lung symptoms. But how do you tell someone that a mine closed 16 years ago is still operating with a crew of dead workers? Hank listened patiently, then started setting up his equipment. He was a practical man who believed in science and proper procedures. Gas leaks, he could handle. Equipment failures, he'd seen plenty. But ghosts? That wasn't in his training manual. "Probably got some kind of geological shift," he said, checking his readings. "Underground river changes course, opens up old gas pockets. Happens more than you'd think." His detector started screaming immediately. "Jesus Christ," he muttered, staring at the display. "These readings are off the charts. How long has this been going on?" "Since Tuesday," I said, when the university team first reported the anomalies. "We need to evacuate this whole area," Hank said. "These gas levels could cause an explosion that would take half the mountain down." But as we worked to set up a wider safety perimeter, things got worse. At midnight, we found the second graduate student. His name was Kevin Wu, and we discovered him inside mine shaft number 12, which should have been impossible since that entrance was sealed with 3 feet of concrete. But there he was, sitting on the ground just inside the barrier, aged 20 years and 3 days. Kevin's hair had gone completely gray. His face was lined with deep wrinkles, and his hands shook with the tremor of an old man. When he spoke, It was in the heavy mountain accent of miners from the 1942nd, using words and phrases that went out of style before he was born. "Shift's running long tonight," he said, looking at us with eyes that were far too old. "Foreman's pushing hard for quota. Says, we're behind schedule. Kevin, it's Ranger Ironwood. Do you remember me? Do you remember the university survey?" He stared at me for a long moment, confused. Then something cleared in his expression. "Survey?" he said, his voice cracking back to normal. "Oh God, the survey. How long have I been down there? It feels like years." 3 days, I told him. "No," he said, shaking his head. "No, that can't be right. I've been working the coalface for months. The foreman, he won't let us leave until we make quota. And we never make quota." Kevin collapsed before we could get him to the truck. Hank tried CPR, but it was too late. Whatever had happened to him in that impossible space behind the concrete seal, it had burned through his life force like a candle in a windstorm. That left one student still missing. "I'm going in," Hank announced, strapping on his breathing apparatus and checking his gas detector. "If there's someone still alive in there, we have to try." "Hank, those shafts are sealed. There's no way in or out." "Then how did these kids get inside?" He pointed to Kevin's body. "There's got to be another entrance we're missing, maybe a ventilation shaft or an old access tunnel." I tried to stop him, tried to explain about the phantom miners and the impossible things I'd seen. But Hank was a rational man in an irrational situation, and rational men do rational things even when they're completely wrong. He entered mine shaft number 12 through a maintenance access I didn't even know existed. 6 hours later, we found him in the same spot where Kevin had been sitting, perfectly preserved but changed in a way that made my skin crawl. Hank's body was completely black. Not burned or covered in coal dust, but black through and through, like he'd been carved from a single piece of coal. His skin, his clothes, even his eyes were the deep, lightless black of anthracite. But he was still breathing, still alive, still trying to speak. "The foreman," he whispered, his voice like wind through dead leaves. He says there's always room for more workers. The mine is hungry." Then Hank stopped breathing, and I was alone with Dr. Santos, who was dying slowly from black lung disease, and the growing certainty that something in these mountains was collecting workers for a shift that would never end. At 2 a.m., my grandfather's mining helmet started showing up in impossible places. I kept it on my dashboard as a remembrance, but now it was appearing at different mine entrances every time I turned around. First at shaft 7, then at shaft 12, then at shaft 3, where no one had worked since the 1960s. Each time I went to retrieve it, the helmet would vanish and reappear somewhere else. And each time, I could hear my grandfather's voice calling from deep underground. "Cal," he said, his voice echoing up from the darkness. "Cal, come down and help us finish the work. We're so close to making quota." The phantom miners were getting stronger. I could see them clearly now, dozens of men in mining gear moving through the sealed shafts like the concrete barriers were just shadows. Fresh coal was appearing at the entrances, piled high in neat mounds that shouldn't exist from mines that had been played out for decades. And the sounds never stopped. Pickaxes and shovels, cartwheels on rails, men calling out warnings about gas pockets and unstable walls. The sounds of an active mining operation running at full capacity, all of it coming from underground spaces that were supposed to be flooded and silent. My radio crackled again, and this time the voice was clear. "Ranger Ironwood, this is Marcus Chen, University Geology Team. Can anyone hear me?" The third student, the one still missing. "Marcus, this is Cal Ironwood. Where are you?" "I'm trapped." His voice came through the static. "I'm in some kind of mine tunnel, but it's not on any of the survey maps. There are men here, working. They say I can't leave until the shift is over. But the shift never ends." "It never ends." The radio went dead. I stood there in the darkness, surrounded by the sounds of impossible mining operations, holding my grandfather's helmet that kept appearing and disappearing like a supernatural calling card. Dr. Santos was dying in my truck. 3 men were dead. And somewhere in the mountain, Marcus Chen was trapped in a mine that shouldn't exist, working a shift that had been running for 51 years. The mine whistle blew again, long and mournful in the night, and I realized that if I wanted to save Marcus Chen, I was going to have to go down into the darkness and punch a time card for a job that would last forever. At 6 a.m., I made the decision that probably saved my life and definitely changed it forever. I was going into the mines. Dr. Santos had finally succumbed to the black lung disease, dying in my truck as the sun came up over the mountains. Her last words were about shift quotas and the foreman's expectations. 3 good people were dead, and Marcus Chen was still trapped somewhere in the impossible tunnels beneath Black Damp Ridge. I loaded my gear: breathing apparatus, gas detector, emergency oxygen, rope rescue equipment, and my grandfather's helmet, which had reappeared on my dashboard right at sunrise. This time, I put it on. The moment the old helmet settled on my head, everything changed. I could see the mines as they really were, not the sealed, flooded shafts of 1,994, but the active, dangerous tunnels of 1,943. The concrete barriers were still there, but now they were like heat shimmer, insubstantial as a memory. I could walk right through them. Mine shaft number 7 opened before me like a mouth full of teeth. The tunnel beyond was lit by carbide lamps and electric bulbs, full of the sounds of active mining. Cart rails gleamed with recent use. Wooden support timbers creaked under the weight of the mountain above. And everywhere, the phantom miners went about their work with the grim determination of the eternally employed. "About time you showed up," said a voice behind me. I turned around and faced my grandfather for the first time in 51 years. John Ironwood looked exactly like he had in the old family photographs, except for his eyes. His eyes held the weight of 5 decades spent working in the dark, digging coal for a company that didn't care if he lived or died. "Grandpa?" My voice cracked like I was 12 years old again. "Been waiting for you, Cal. Been waiting for someone from the family to come help us finish the job." He gestured toward the tunnel that stretched away into darkness. "We're close to quota, but the seam keeps moving deeper. Always deeper. You're dead, Grandpa. You all died in 1943. Dead don't mean much down here," he said sadly. "Company wants its coal. Foreman won't let us rest until we make our numbers. But we never make our numbers, Cal. There's always more coal to dig." As we walked deeper into the mine, I saw the full scope of what had happened. The phantom miners had been trapped in an endless cycle, working the same shifts over and over again, trying to reach production quotas that were designed to be impossible. They were driven by the same pressures that had killed them in life. The need to provide for their families, to keep their jobs, to prove their worth through hard work. "Where's Marcus Chen?" I asked. "New worker," Grandpa said. "Good with the technical equipment. Foreman has him running surveys in the deep tunnels. Says we might hit a new seam if we go far enough down." We passed other miners I recognized from old photographs and family stories. Men who had died in cave-ins, gas explosions, and lung disease, all of them still working, still trying to finish a job that would never end. Some nodded as we passed. Others were too focused on their work to notice. The tunnel system was vast, extending far beyond the original mine blueprints. The phantom miners had been digging for 51 years, creating new passages and shafts that existed in some space between the real world and whatever comes after death. The mountain itself had become a supernatural prison, holding these men in service to a company that had forgotten their names. We found Marcus Chen a mile underground, operating some kind of impossible drilling equipment that glowed with spectral light. He was working alongside miners from the 1,940 seconds, 1,950 seconds, and 1,960 seconds. All of them focused on reaching a coal seam that seemed to recede as they approached it. "Marcus," I called out. He looked up, and I saw that his eyes were already starting to change. The same glassy, obsessed look that had taken Kevin Wu and Dr. Santos. The mine was claiming him, making him part of its eternal workforce. "Can't stop now," Marcus said. "Foreman says we're close to a breakthrough, just a few more hours of work." That's when I met the foreman. Thomas Brennan had been the shift supervisor who died in the 1943 explosion. He was a big man with arms like tree trunks and a voice that could cut through the noise of heavy machinery. But death had changed him. His presence filled the tunnel like smoke, and his eyes burned with an obsession that went beyond human need. "You must be young, Ironwood," he said, looking me up and down. "Your grandfather speaks highly of your work ethic. We could use a man with your skills down here." "Let Marcus go," I said. "He doesn't belong here." "Everyone belongs here," Brennan replied. Everyone who enters the mine becomes part of the crew. That's always been the rule. Company policy. The company's been dead for 16 years. Company never dies, Brennan said, with a grin that showed too many teeth. Company just changes names. Work goes on. Always more coal to dig, always more quotas to meet. I realized then what was really happening. These men hadn't just died in industrial accidents. They'd been murdered by a system that valued profits over human life, that set impossible quotas and ignored safety warnings, that treated workers like expendable equipment. Their spirits couldn't rest because their work had never been acknowledged, their deaths had never been properly mourned, and their sacrifice had been forgotten. What if I could end the shift? I asked. Brennan laughed, a sound like rocks falling down a mine shaft. Shift ends when quota is met. Quota is never met. Work goes on. But my grandfather stepped forward, and for the first time in 51 years, he challenged the foreman's authority. What if, he said slowly, what if someone from management came down to officially end the shift? Someone with the authority to close the books and send the workers home? I understood what he was asking me to do. In my jacket pocket, I still had my ranger credentials, my federal authorization to oversee industrial heritage sites. In the supernatural logic of the mine, that made me management. That gave me the power to officially end a shift that had been running since 1943. The tunnel began to shake as Brennan realized what was happening. His control over the phantom miners was breaking down, and he fought back with the fury of a man who had built his identity around exploitation and abuse. No one leaves until quota is met, he roared, his voice becoming inhuman, monstrous. Company policy, company policy. The mountain itself seemed to rebel against the idea of the workers going free. Support timbers cracked and fell. Gas leaked from the walls, creating an explosive atmosphere that could blow us all to kingdom come. Cart tracks twisted and buckled, blocking the tunnels. But the miners had had enough. One by one, they stopped working. Pickaxes fell silent. Shovels hit the ground with metallic rings. 51 years of enforced labor came to an end, as men who had died for their work finally chose to rest. I'm officially ending this shift, I announced, pulling out my ranger badge. All workers are released from duty. Time cards are signed. Quotas are suspended, pending safety review. The phantom miners began to fade, but not with sadness. They looked relieved, grateful, finally free to go home to families they'd been trying to support for over half a century. My grandfather was the last to go. Take care of the mountain, Cal, he said, his voice growing distant. There are other mines, other workers who can't rest. Remember us. And then they were gone, leaving me alone with Marcus Chen and a tunnel system that was collapsing back into the real world. The supernatural extensions of the mine vanished, the impossible equipment disappeared, and suddenly we were just two men lost in a flooded mine shaft with rapidly depleting oxygen. Getting out took 6 hours of crawling through unstable tunnels and swimming through flooded passages. By the time we reached the surface, rescue teams were arriving, drawn by the emergency beacon I'd activated before going underground. Marcus made a full recovery, though he never spoke publicly about what happened in the mines. The official report blamed gas leaks and hallucinations caused by carbon monoxide poisoning. The university called off its geological survey and sealed the case files. But I knew the truth. The phantom miners of Black Damp Ridge were finally at rest. 6 months after the incident at Hartwell Mining Complex, I was diagnosed with chronic respiratory disease and forced into early medical retirement. The mine had taken its toll on me, just like it had taken its toll on everyone who went down into those tunnels. But I was alive, which was more than Dr. Santos, Kevin Wu, and Inspector Daniels could say. The mining complex was officially designated as structurally compromised and closed to public access. Heavy security was installed, and the remaining open shafts were sealed with industrial-grade barriers. The cover story involved methane pocket explosions and unstable ground conditions. No mention was made of phantom miners or supernatural phenomena. But the work wasn't finished. During my recovery, I started researching other abandoned mining sites throughout Appalachia. What I found disturbed me more than anything I'd experienced at Black Damp Ridge. Similar reports were coming in from dozens of locations. Unexplained sounds, equipment malfunctions, workers who disappeared or died under impossible circumstances. The coal industry had left scars across these mountains that went deeper than abandoned shafts and toxic runoff. Generations of workers had died in preventable accidents, killed by companies that prioritized profits over safety. Many of those workers were still trapped, still working, still trying to meet quotas for employers who had forgotten their names. I established a registry through the National Park Service, documenting sites where industrial accidents had created what I called unfinished business hauntings. Miners, steel workers, railroad men, anyone who had died on the job in circumstances that prevented proper closure. The list grew longer every month. Marcus Chen recovered from his ordeal and went on to become a leading researcher in what he carefully termed geological anomalies associated with industrial heritage sites. He never used the word supernatural in his papers, but anyone who read between the lines could understand what he was really studying. The phantom miners of Black Damp Ridge stayed quiet after our encounter, but I monitored the site regularly. Every few months, I'd find fresh coal on my truck tailgate or discover my grandfather's helmet in impossible locations. Small signs that the connection between our world and theirs wasn't completely severed. And sometimes, on November nights when the wind is right and the mountain air carries sounds from impossible distances, I can still hear the mine whistles blowing shift changes for workers who punched out 51 years late. The mountains of West Virginia are full of holes where men used to dig coal, and some of those holes remember everything. If you're ever hiking in abandoned mining country and you hear the sound of pickaxes or machinery coming from sealed shafts, don't investigate, don't try to help. Just leave, quickly and quietly, and let the dead finish their work in peace. But if you're a ranger or an inspector or anyone else with official authority over these sites, remember that sometimes the best way to help trapped workers is to give them permission to go home. Even if they've been waiting decades for someone to sign their time cards and tell them the shift is finally over. The mining companies are gone, but the miners remain, and they're still looking for someone in management who gives a damn about the people who died making other men rich. Sometimes that's all it takes to set things right. Sometimes that's enough to let the dead finally rest. Asterisk. Final word count, approximately 4,200 words. My name is Elijah Moonbrook, but everyone calls me Eli. I've been a park ranger for 13 years now, working the deep hollows and high ridges of the Great Smoky Mountains. Most folks think my job is about bears and lost hikers, but I spend most of my time protecting old places, the ruins and artifacts left behind by mountain families who lived here before this land became a national park. I'm good at what I do because this place is in my blood. My great-grandfather was born in these mountains, back when families made their living from whatever the land could give them. That's why I speak the old mountain dialect, why I know which plants heal and which ones kill, and why I can read the stories written in stone foundations and rusted metal scattered through the woods. It was August 1989 when everything changed. The worst heat wave in decades had settled over the mountains like a heavy blanket. Temperatures hit over 100 degrees day after day, and the whole park was under fire watch. Even the creeks were running low, exposing rocks that hadn't seen sunlight in years. That's when Dr. Robert Hayes called from the University of Tennessee. His archaeological team had been studying old moonshine sites, places where mountain families had made whiskey during Prohibition. It was important work, documenting the culture that existed here before the government forced everyone out in the 1,930 seconds. Eli, Dr. Hayes said over the phone, his voice tight with excitement, "You need to see what we found at Cataract Creek. There's something impossible happening here." I knew the Cataract Creek site well. It sat in a hidden hollow about 15 miles from the nearest hiking trail, accessible only by following the creek bed through a maze of rhododendron thickets. The place had history, bad history. In 1927, federal agents raided the Whitlock family operation there. 8 people died in the shooting, including 3 children. The surviving family members were driven off their land and died in poverty within a few years. When I reached the site 3 days later, I found Dr. Hayes' camp, but no Dr. Hayes. His tent was still set up, breakfast dishes unwashed, notebook open to pages covered with increasingly frantic handwriting. The last entry read, "The still is active, impossible but true, fresh mash, warm copper, perfect whiskey." How can this be? I followed the path through the trees to where the old Whitlock homestead had stood. The stone foundation was still there, along with the remains of a root cellar and what had once been a barn. But it was the moonshine still that made my skin crawl. The copper pot gleamed like it had been polished yesterday. Steam rose from the mash barrel, and I could smell the sharp, sweet scent of fermenting corn. A thin stream of clear liquid dripped from the copper coil into a mason jar that was already half full. I touched the copper. It was warm. That should have been impossible. The Whitlock still had been destroyed in the raid 62 years ago. Even if someone had rebuilt it, there was no way to haul the heavy copper pots this deep into the wilderness without leaving obvious trails. I pulled out my camera to document the scene, but the LCD screen showed nothing but static. My GPS unit spun wildly before showing an elevation reading that put me 300 feet underground. Even my compass needle swung in lazy circles, unable to find magnetic north. The heat was getting to me. That had to be it. I was seeing things, my equipment was malfunctioning because of the temperature, and my imagination was filling in the rest. But when I knelt by the mash barrel and looked inside, I saw fresh corn and barley still floating on top, and the smell was so strong it made my eyes water. That's when I heard the voices. They drifted through the trees like smoke, speaking in the old mountain dialect my great-grandfather had taught me. Two men discussing the weather, worrying about federal agents, debating whether they had enough sugar to finish the next batch. The voices were clear as day, but when I looked around, I saw nothing but empty woods. I spent that first night at Dr. Hayes' abandoned camp, listening to sounds that shouldn't exist. Glass clinking against glass. Footsteps on wooden floors where no floors remained. The creak of wagon wheels and the soft snort of mules. Sometimes I caught glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision. A figure in overalls walking between trees. A woman hanging laundry on a line that wasn't there. By morning, I had convinced myself it was heat, exhaustion, and stress. But when I returned to the still site, I found a fresh jar of moonshine sitting on a stump, still warm from the process. The liquid inside was crystal clear and smelled like heaven. I didn't drink it. Something deep in my gut told me that would be a mistake I'd never recover from. The next day brought Dr. Margaret Riddle, the park historian I'd called for consultation. Margaret was a tough woman in her 50s who had spent 30 years documenting Appalachian culture. If anyone could explain what was happening at Cataract Creek, it would be her. "This is remarkable," she said as we stood before the active still. "The preservation is impossible. Copper should have corroded, wood should have rotted, and the stonework should have shifted and cracked." She knelt beside the mash barrel and took photographs with an old film camera. "Digital equipment won't work here," she said. "I tried yesterday at another site and got nothing but interference." "What other site?" I asked. "The cemetery. About a quarter-mile up the hollow. 8 graves, all fresh." She looked at me with troubled eyes. "Eli, those graves are dated 1927, but the flowers on them are less than a week old." We climbed through the thick undergrowth to the family cemetery. Sure enough, 8 simple headstones stood in perfect rows, the carved names still sharp and clear. Ezra Whitlock, age 34. Mary Whitlock, age 29. Children aged 12, 8, and 6. 3 other family members I didn't recognize. Fresh mountain laurel lay on every grave. Wild flowers that had been picked recently and arranged with care. At the head of the largest grave sat a mason jar half full of moonshine, and beside it, a tin cup. "Someone's been maintaining this place," Margaret said. "But who? The nearest neighbor is 15 miles away, and this hollow isn't on any map." I knelt beside Ezra Whitlock's grave and noticed something that made my blood run cold. Carved into the stone beneath his name were the words, "Still waiting for justice." That night, things got worse. I was lying in my sleeping bag when I heard footsteps circling our camp. Slow, deliberate steps that crunched through dead leaves and stopped just outside the ring of our flashlight's glow. Margaret heard it too. We sat back to back, listening to someone, or something, walking a patient circle around us for nearly an hour. "Who's there?" I called out several times but got no answer except the continued walking. In the morning, we found tracks in the soft dirt around our camp. Boot prints from the 1922, with thick soles and square toes that hadn't been made in decades. The tracks led from our camp to the still site, then disappeared at the edge of the stone foundation. That's when we found Dr. Patricia Chen. She was sitting beside the still, perfectly calm, wearing clothes that looked like they came from a museum, long dress, button-up boots, hair pinned back in a style from 70 years ago. When she saw us, she smiled and spoke in a mountain accent I'd only heard from the oldest residents. "Morning, folks. Y'all here to help with the batch? Ezra's been working all night, and we're behind schedule." Margaret and I looked at each other. Dr. Chen was part of the missing archaeological team, but this wasn't the woman who had called the university 3 days ago. That doctor, Chen, had been born in California and spoke with a slight accent from years of living in various countries. This woman sounded like she'd been born in these mountains a century ago. "Patricia," I said carefully, "do you remember me? I'm Eli Moonbrook, the park ranger." She tilted her head like she was trying to remember something from a long time ago. "Moonbrook, ain't that the family that guided the federal men in 27? Ezra mentioned, you might be coming around." The blood drained from my face. My great-grandfather had been Nathan Moonbrook, and family stories said he'd worked as a guide for federal agents during Prohibition. It was something we didn't talk about. Mountain families had long memories, and helping the government against your neighbors was the worst kind of betrayal. "Where are the other members of your team?" Margaret asked. "Team?" Dr. Chen looked confused. "Ain't no team. Just family. Ezra and Mary, the young'uns, Uncle Silas. We got work to do before the Federals come back." She stood and walked to the still, where she began stirring the mash with a wooden paddle. The motions were practiced, natural, like she'd been doing it all her life. But Patricia Chen was a college professor who specialized in pottery fragments and had probably never seen a moonshine operation before this week. "Patricia," Margaret said firmly, "you're Dr. Patricia Chen from UC Berkeley. You came here to study Appalachian material culture. Do you remember any of that?" For just a moment, confusion flickered across her face. There was something. A university? Then she shook her head and went back to stirring. "Don't know what you're talking about, miss. I'm Mary Whitlock, and this here's my family's operation." That's when I realized Dr. Chen thought she was Mary Whitlock, Ezra's wife, who had been shot and killed by federal agents 62 years ago. Margaret grabbed my arm and pulled me away from the still. "We need to get help," she whispered. Something's happened to her mind. But as we walked back toward our camp, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't Dr. Chen's mind that had changed. It was everything else. We tried to reach the outside world, but our radio only picked up static mixed with something that sounded like old-time mountain music. When Margaret hiked out to the nearest ranger station, she came back pale and shaking. "The trail's gone," she said. "I walked for 6 hours and never found the main path. It's like the landscape has changed. Every time I thought I was getting somewhere, I'd end up back at the creek." That night, we heard the music for the first time. It started just after sunset. Fiddle and banjo, played in the old style my great-grandfather had taught me. The music drifted through the trees from the direction of the homestead, accompanied by voices singing songs I recognized from childhood. Mountain ballads about love and death, about leaving home and never coming back. Against every instinct I had, we followed the music. The homestead ruins were transformed. Where there had been only stone foundations and scattered debris, now I saw the ghost of what had once stood there. Translucent walls shimmered in the moonlight, and through them I could see people moving around. A man in overalls worked at the still, while a woman in a long dress fed chickens that weren't there. Children played with a dog that cast no shadow. "Do you see them?" Margaret whispered. I nodded, not trusting my voice. The man at the still looked up and saw us watching. He had a kind face marked by hard work and worry lines, and when he smiled, I felt a chill run down my spine. He raised his hand in greeting, like we were expected guests, then went back to his work. "That's Ezra Whitlock," I said. "I've seen his photograph in the historical records." We watched the Phantom family go about their evening routine for nearly an hour. They seemed completely real, except for the way moonlight passed through them and the fact that their voices carried no weight in the air. When the man, Ezra, walked to the mash barrel, I could hear his footsteps on wooden floors that no longer existed. The next morning brought a new horror. We found Dr. Robert Hayes. He was sitting in what had once been the front yard, playing checkers with empty air. Like Dr. Chen, he wore clothes from another era and spoke in the mountain dialect. But unlike her transformation, his was clearly unfinished. He kept flickering between his normal self and whatever he was becoming. "Eli?" he said in his normal voice, looking confused and frightened. How long have I been here? I was documenting the still, and then his voice changed, became rougher, older. Then Silas asked if I wanted to learn the family business. Good, honest work, better than what them government men offer. Bob, I said, you're Dr. Robert Hayes from the University of Tennessee. You called me 4 days ago about impossible artifacts. He stared at me for a long moment, and I could see him fighting to remember. University. Yes, I remember. But that was before Silas showed me how the family takes care of its own. He gestured to the empty space beside him. Silas Whitlock, meet Eli Moonbrook. Eli's great-granddaddy helped the Federals, but Silas says a man ain't responsible for his family's mistakes. Margaret touched my arm. We need to get them out of here. But when we tried to lead Dr. Hayes away from the homestead, he became agitated and refused to move beyond a certain invisible line. Can't leave, he said, switching back to his normal voice for a moment. They need me to help with the work. If I leave, they'll be alone again. That's when I understood what was happening. The Whitlock family wasn't just haunting this place, they were rebuilding their community. They were recruiting the living to replace the family members they'd lost. That night, Margaret started changing too. I woke to find her gone from her sleeping bag. I followed the sound of voices to the still site, where I found her deep in conversation with empty air. She was discussing the proper way to proof whiskey with someone I couldn't see, nodding and taking notes in a small notebook. Margaret, I called. She looked up, and for a second, her eyes were those of a stranger. My name's Annie, she said in a mountain accent. Annie Whitlock. Ezra's sister. Then she blinked, and she was Margaret again. Eli? What happened? I was in my sleeping bag, and then I was here talking to. She looked around in confusion. Who was I talking to? But I had seen the notebook in her hand. When she looked down at it, the pages were covered with handwriting that wasn't hers. Detailed notes about moonshine production written in an old-fashioned script. The transformation was accelerating. By the third day, Margaret was spending more time as Annie Whitlock than as herself. Dr. Hayes had stopped responding to his real name entirely and introduced himself as William Whitlock, a family member who had died in the 1927 raid. And Dr. Chen never broke character at all. She worked at the still from dawn to dusk, humming mountain songs and talking to family members. I couldn't see about the weather and the crops and when the federal agents might come back. I was the only one left who remembered the real world, and I could feel the pressure building in my skull like water behind a cracked dam. Every hour I spent at the homestead, every breath of air that carried the scent of mash and wood smoke, every word I heard spoken in the mountain dialect pulled me deeper into their reality. On the fourth night, I dreamed I was Nathan Moonbrook, my great-grandfather, leading federal agents through the mountains toward the Whitlock operation. In the dream, I knew what would happen: the shooting, the death of children, the destruction of a family that had never hurt anyone. But I couldn't stop walking, couldn't change the path that led to 8 graves in a hidden cemetery. I woke up speaking in my great-grandfather's voice, and for a terrifying moment, I couldn't remember my own name. On the 5th morning, I made the decision that probably saved my life, or maybe damned it. I was going to drink the moonshine. It sounds crazy, but I had noticed something about the others. Their transformations had started after they'd spent time near the still, breathing the fumes and absorbing the atmosphere. But none of them had actually tasted the whiskey. The mason jars sat untouched, always full, always waiting. Maybe the whiskey was the key. Maybe it would complete the transformation and make me one of them forever, or maybe it would show me the truth behind what was happening. Either way, I was losing myself piece by piece, and I needed answers before I lost the ability to ask questions. I walked to the still at dawn, when the mountain air was thick with mist, and the only sounds were creek water running over stones and the distant call of a wood thrush. The jar of moonshine sat where it always did, clear as mountain water and twice as dangerous. I picked it up and looked through the translucent liquid at the world beyond. For just a moment, I saw the homestead as it really was, empty ruins covered with 70 years of neglect. Then I tilted the jar to my lips and drank. The whiskey burned like liquid fire going down, but it wasn't unpleasant. It tasted like corn and wood smoke and something else. Something that reminded me of childhood summers and my great-grandfather's stories about the old days. As the warmth spread through my chest, the world around me began to change. The ruins filled in like a photograph developing in slow motion. Walls materialized, transparent at first, then solid as stone. A roof spread itself across the rafters, and windows appeared in frames that had been empty for decades. The smell of wood smoke grew stronger, and I heard the sound of chickens clucking and a dog barking somewhere behind the house. That's when I saw them clearly for the first time. The Whitlock family stood in their front yard, watching me with expressions of hope and desperate need. Ezra, a man in his 30s with calloused hands and kind eyes. Mary, his wife, holding a baby that flickered in and out of existence. 3 children, ranging from 6 to 12, all dressed in their Sunday best despite the early hour. And standing slightly apart from the family group were my colleagues, Dr. Hayes, Dr. Chen, and Margaret. But they looked different now. Solid. Real. Like they had always belonged here. "Welcome home, Nathan," Ezra said, and I realized he was speaking to me in my great-grandfather's name. "I'm not Nathan," I said. "I'm Eli." Nathan Moonbrook was my great-grandfather. Ezra's face fell. "But your family, you have his blood, his voice. You came back to make things right." "Make what right?" Mary stepped forward, and I could see the bullet holes in her dress now, dark stains that never dried. "The raid, Nathan. You led them to us. You told them we were running a big operation, selling to gangsters in the city, but we weren't. We were just trying to feed our children." The memory hit me like a physical blow. Not my memory, but Nathan's, passed down through blood and guilt. My great-grandfather had needed the money federal agents offered for information about moonshine operations. His own family was hungry, and the government promised enough cash to get them through the winter. He told them about the Whitlock still, exaggerating its size and importance to increase his payment. "He didn't know," I said. "He didn't know they would kill you." "But they did," said one of the children, a girl who couldn't have been more than 8 when she died. "They shot Papa first, then Mama when she tried to help him. Uncle Silas tried to protect us, but they shot him too. Then they shot me and Caleb and little Rebecca." The weight of generational guilt settled on my shoulders like a lead blanket. "What do you want from me?" "Justice," Ezra said. "Recognition. For 70 years, we've been written up in the history books as criminals, as outlaws who deserved what we got. But we were just poor mountain folk trying to survive. Your blood brought the killers to our door. Your blood can set things right." I looked at my colleagues, hoping to see some recognition in their eyes, some memory of who they really were. But Dr. Hayes, now William Whitlock, just smiled at me like an old friend. Margaret, now Annie, was knitting something that looked like baby clothes. And Dr. Chen, now Mary Whitlock, was humming while she worked at the still, completely absorbed in her phantom life. "If I help you," I said, "if I give you what you want, will you let them go?" Ezra considered this. "They're family now. They chose to stay, chose to help us. But," he looked at his wife, and some silent communication passed between them. "If the federal government acknowledges what was done to us, if they admit the raid was wrong and we were innocent, then maybe our work here would be finished." "I can't speak for the federal government." "You wear their badge," Mary said. "You work for them, just like Nathan did. You have their authority." That's when I understood. They didn't want revenge. They wanted recognition. They wanted someone in authority to admit that what happened to them was wrong, that they had been innocent victims rather than dangerous criminals. I thought about the memorial that could be built here, the historical markers that could tell the real story of the Whitlock family. I thought about the reports I could write, the documentation I could provide. Maybe it wouldn't bring them peace, but it might be enough to release the people they'd recruited. "All right," I said, "I'll help you. But first, you have to show me what really happened that day." The world shifted around me like smoke, and suddenly it was 1927. The vision, or whatever it was, lasted only minutes, but it felt like hours. I watched my great-grandfather lead 12 federal agents through the mountains to this hidden hollow. I saw the fear in his eyes when he realized they meant to kill rather than arrest. I watched him try to warn the family, try to call off the raid. But it was too late. The agents opened fire the moment Ezra stepped out of his cabin with his hands raised. They shot the children when they ran. They shot Mary when she tried to shield her baby. They destroyed the still and burned the cabin. Then wrote in their report that the Whitlock family had resisted arrest and opened fire first. My great-grandfather carried that guilt for the rest of his life, and apparently passed it down through the bloodline like a curse. When the vision ended, I found myself standing in the ruins again, but everything looked different now. The phantom homestead was fading, becoming translucent around the edges. The Whitlock family stood before me, waiting. "I'll file a report," I told them. "I'll document what really happened here and recommend that the Park Service create a memorial. I can't promise it will change the history books, but I can promise the truth will be told." Ezra nodded slowly. "That's all we wanted. Someone to know we weren't criminals." One by one, they began to fade. The children first, then the adults, until only Ezra remained. "Tell them we were good people," he said. "Tell them we loved this land and only wanted to take care of our families." "I will." He smiled, and for a moment he looked like he might have in life. Tired but hopeful, a man who worked hard and loved deeply. Then he was gone, and I was standing alone in the ruins. Margaret, Dr. Hayes, and Dr. Chen lay unconscious near the cold remains of the still. When they woke up hours later, they remembered nothing after arriving at the site. Their notebooks contained pages of handwriting they didn't recognize, and Dr. Chen had developed a strange appreciation for mountain music she'd never shown before. I filed my report as promised. 3 months later, the Park Service approved a memorial to the Whitlock family and other victims of Prohibition-era violence. It wasn't much, just a simple plaque and a small parking area for visitors, but it told the truth about what happened here. The strange thing is, I still taste that moonshine sometimes. Not the burn of alcohol, but the deeper flavor underneath, the taste of corn grown in mountain soil, of water from hidden springs, of hands that worked with love and desperation. It comes back to me at odd moments, usually when I'm deep in the woods, alone except for the sound of wind through the trees. And sometimes, on quiet nights when the moon is full, I hear music drifting through the forest, fiddle and banjo played in the old style, voices singing songs about home and loss and the people we leave behind. I never go looking for the source of that music anymore. Some doors, once opened, should stay that way. I've been working with other rangers now, documenting sites throughout Appalachia where similar things have happened. Places where violence and injustice left wounds that never healed, where the dead keep trying to tell their stories to anyone willing to listen. Because that's what they were doing, really. The Whitlock family wasn't trying to hurt anyone, they were trying to be remembered. They were trying to make sure their children didn't die for nothing, that their story wasn't buried with their bones. I think about that a lot now, especially when I'm walking through the deep woods where old homesteads used to stand. How many stories are hidden in these mountains? How many voices are still waiting to be heard? If you ever find yourself in a place where the past feels too close, where the air tastes like old smoke, and you hear music that shouldn't exist, remember this: the dead don't always want to hurt the living. Sometimes they just want someone to know they existed, that they mattered, that their lives meant something. And if you're ever offered moonshine that tastes like memories, think carefully before you drink. Some flavors, once tasted, never leave your mouth. My name is Eli Moonbrook, and I know the dead have stories to tell. The question is whether you're brave enough to listen. My name is Rebecca Thornfield, but everyone calls me Becca. I've been a forest ranger for 10 years now, working the Cherokee National Forest in North Carolina. Most people think my job is about campfires and lost hikers, but I'm actually a botanist. I study plants, especially the old Cherokee healing plants that grow in these mountains. I'm part Cherokee myself. My great-grandmother was full-blood before the family mixed with settlers. She taught me some of the old plant songs when I was little, though I never thought much about them until I started working here. Now, I wish I'd listened better. It was September 1983 when everything started. The leaves were just beginning to turn, and it should have been perfect weather for collecting medicinal plants. Instead, we'd been having the worst drought in 50 years. Every creek was dry, every plant was dying, except in one place. Medicine Creek Basin sits 20 miles from the nearest road, hidden in a valley so deep you can't see it until you're right on top of it. The Cherokee used to call it something else, a word my great-grandmother whispered but never translated. The old maps don't show it. Most rangers don't even know it exists. I first heard about the place from Dr. James Morrison at Duke University. He called me on a Tuesday morning, voice tight with excitement. "Ranger Thornfield," he said, "we found something impossible. Plants that died out 100 years ago, growing like they never left. Perfect specimens. We need someone who knows Cherokee medicine to verify what we're seeing." I should have been excited. Finding extinct plants is every botanist's dream. But something about his voice made my skin crawl. He sounded afraid. "What kind of plants?" I asked. "Everything," he whispered. "Ghost root, spirit tobacco, Cherokee rose varieties that haven't been seen since before the Trail of Tears. And they're not just alive, Ranger. They're thriving." I packed my gear that afternoon. Standard botanical collection supplies, plant presses, identification books, pH testing kits. I also brought something most rangers don't carry: a folder of Cherokee medicine descriptions my great-grandmother had written down before she died. The trail to Medicine Creek starts behind Crying Falls, where the Cherokee say the mountain weeps for the dead. It's not marked on any map, just a deer path that winds between two limestone cliffs. I'd hiked these mountains for years and never noticed it before. The first strange thing I saw was the creek itself. While every other water source in the forest had dried up, Medicine Creek ran clear and full, not just running, singing. The water made soft music as it flowed over the rocks, almost like voices humming healing songs. The second strange thing was the mist. Even in the drought heat, a cool fog hung over the valley floor. It should have burned off by noon, but it stayed, wrapping around the trees like gentle arms. The third strange thing was the silence. No birds, no insects, no wind, just the creek singing and the soft whisper of my boots on the trail. I made camp in a small clearing near the water. As I set up my tent, I noticed plants I hadn't seen in years. Cherokee rose bushes with blooms the size of dinner plates, wild ginseng growing in perfect spirals, golden seal carpeting the forest floor like it was planted on purpose. And they were all perfect. Not a brown leaf, not a wilted stem, not a single bug bite on any of them. I made notes until the sun set, trying to document what I was seeing. My handwriting looked shaky on the page. I told myself it was excitement, but deep down I knew it was fear. As darkness fell, the mist began to glow with soft blue light. I'd never seen anything like it. The Cherokee stories talked about spirit lights, but I'd always thought they were just stories. I was wrong about a lot of things. I woke up to singing. At first I thought it was the creek, but as I lay in my sleeping bag listening, I realized it was voices. Human voices, singing in Cherokee. The old healing songs my great-grandmother used to hum while she worked in her garden. I checked my watch. 3:17 a.m. The singing was coming from downstream, toward the center of the valley. I should have stayed in my tent. Any smart person would have stayed in their tent. But I'm a botanist, and botanists are curious by nature. I grabbed my flashlight and followed the sound. The mist was thicker now, and my light barely cut through it. The Cherokee singing got louder as I walked, joined by other sounds. The soft thud of grinding stones, the rustle of plants being harvested, the crackle of small fires. I smelled wood smoke and something else, herbs being prepared for medicine, wild cherry bark and ghost root mixed with plants I couldn't identify. Then my light hit something that made me stop breathing. Footprints in the mud beside the creek. Fresh ones, made by soft leather shoes. Moccasins. I knelt down and touched one, still warm. The singing stopped. Everything stopped. Even the creek went quiet. The mist seemed to hold its breath around me. I stood up slowly, my hands shaking. "Hello?" I called. "Is someone there?" No answer. But I felt eyes watching me from the darkness. Not animal eyes, human eyes. I backed toward my camp, trying not to run. The silence followed me like a living thing. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. When morning came, I told myself I'd imagined it all. Stress, isolation, maybe bad water, making me hallucinate. I ate breakfast and started collecting plant samples like nothing had happened. That's when I found the first impossible thing. In a grove of ancient oaks, someone had built a garden. Not an old garden, a fresh one, with plants arranged in careful patterns. Cherokee medicine patterns, the kind my great-grandmother had described but never shown me. 7 circles of different plants, each circle dedicated to healing a different part of the body. Heart plants in the center, surrounded by rings of lung plants. Stomach plants, bone plants, blood plants, spirit plants, and mind plants. The arrangement was perfect, like it had been tended for years. but the plants were varieties that had been extinct since the 1800s. I took pictures, though my camera kept malfunctioning. The light meter went crazy, and half the shots came out looking like they were taken underwater. I managed to get a few clear images of the garden layout before my film ran out. That's when I noticed the tools. Scattered around the garden were traditional Cherokee farming implements. Hand-carved wooden hoes, stone grinding bowls, woven baskets for collecting plants. They looked old, but they weren't covered in moss or dirt like abandoned tools should be. They looked used, recently used. I picked up one of the grinding bowls. It was warm, and there were fresh herb fragments in the bottom. Someone had been preparing medicine here within the last few hours. "Hello?" I called again. "I'm not here to hurt anything. I'm Cherokee too. My great-grandmother was Anna Ridge Walker." The mist stirred around me like something had moved through it. For just a moment, I thought I saw a figure standing between the trees. An old woman in traditional dress, watching me with dark, sad eyes. I blinked, and she was gone. But on the ground where she'd been standing, I found a fresh bundle of healing herbs, tied with sinew and marked with symbols I didn't recognize. The plants were still damp, with morning dew that hadn't fallen anywhere else in the valley. I should have left then. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to pack up and hike out. But I'm Cherokee, and this was Cherokee land, and these were Cherokee plants that everyone thought were gone forever. I owed it to my great-grandmother to stay and learn. That was my first mistake. My second mistake was touching the herb bundle. The moment my fingers made contact, the world changed. The mist swirled around me like a living thing, and suddenly I could hear everything. Not just the creek singing, but the plants themselves, whispering to each other in voices like wind through leaves. And somewhere in the whispers, I heard my name. "Rebecca Ridge Walker's granddaughter," the voices said. "She has come home." I dropped the bundle and ran back to my camp, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. But even as I ran, part of me was listening to the plant voices, learning things I'd never studied. Ghost root for crossing between worlds. Spirit tobacco for calling the ancestors. Cherokee rose for healing the heart's deepest wounds. Knowledge that had been lost for 150 years was flowing into my mind like water into a cup. That night, I made my second radio check with the ranger station. "Thornfield here," I said. "All normal in Medicine Creek Basin." It was the last normal thing I would say for a very long time. Dr. Morrison and his team arrived the next morning, hiking into the valley with enough equipment to study a whole forest. There were 3 of them. Morrison himself, Dr. Linda Rodriguez from the botany department, and Dr. Joe Swimmer. Joe was Cherokee Nation, a traditional healer who also had a PhD in plant biology. I was relieved to see him. Finally, someone who might understand what we were dealing with. "This place," Joe said, the moment he stepped into the valley. He stopped walking and closed his eyes, breathing deeply. "The ancestors are strong here. You feel it too?" I asked. He nodded, but his expression was troubled. My grandmother told stories about places like this. Places where the old people went to hide when the soldiers came. Places where they died protecting the sacred plants. Morrison wasn't interested in Cherokee stories. He was interested in the plants, and he attacked the valley like a man possessed. Within an hour, he'd set up collection stations and started cataloging everything he could find. "Look at this ginseng," he called to Rodriguez. "The root formation is unlike anything in the literature. It's like the plant's been selectively bred for maximum potency." "Because it has been," I said quietly, but he wasn't listening. The trouble started that afternoon when Morrison tried to collect samples from the 7-circle garden I'd found. The moment he stepped into the first circle, the mist began to thicken. Not gradually, all at once, like someone had thrown a blanket over the valley. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in seconds. "Did you feel that?" Rodriguez asked, looking around nervously. "Weather front moving in," Morrison said, but his voice was tight. He kept working, digging up plants with mechanical precision. That's when we heard the singing again. Cherokee voices, rising from the mist like they were coming from underwater. Healing songs, but different this time. Sadder. Angrier. Joe went very still. "We need to leave," he said. "Now." "Don't be ridiculous," Morrison snapped. "This is a scientific expedition, not a ghost hunt." The singing got louder and closer. Joe started backing toward the trail. Dr. Morrison, I'm telling you, as both a scientist and a Cherokee man, we are not welcome here. Morrison ignored him and kept digging. He'd found something, a root formation unlike anything I'd ever seen. The ghost root was growing in perfect spirals, like it had been shaped by careful hands. Incredible, he whispered. The cellular structure is. It's impossible. This plant should have died out 150 years ago. It did die out, I said. The soldiers burned the medicine gardens during the removal. Every plant, every seed. Then how is it here? Before I could answer, the root in his hands began to glow. Soft blue light, the same color as the mist, pulsed from the plant like a heartbeat. Morrison dropped it with a curse, but the light didn't fade. Instead, it spread to the other plants in the garden until the entire grove was glowing like stars had fallen to earth. And in that light, we saw them, figures standing between the trees. Dozens of them, watching us with dark, ancient eyes. Cherokee people in traditional dress, their faces painted with symbols I didn't recognize. Some carried bundles of plants, others held grinding stones and medicine bags. They were transparent like reflections in water, but they were real. I could smell the wood smoke from their fires, hear the soft whisper of their breathing. "Oh God," Rodriguez whispered. "Oh my God." The figures began to move toward us, walking through the mist with silent steps. Their leader was the old woman I'd glimpsed before, but now I could see her clearly. She wore the traditional dress of a medicine woman, with sacred plants woven into her gray hair. She stopped 10 feet away from Morrison and spoke in Cherokee. I couldn't understand all the words, but I caught enough to know she was angry. Very angry. "What is she saying?" Morrison demanded. Joe's face was pale, but he translated. She says, we're disturbing the sacred plants. The plants that died to protect the people. She wants us to leave." "This is ridiculous," Morrison said. "Mass hallucination brought on by isolation and stress. There's a perfectly rational explanation for." The medicine woman raised her hand, and Morrison's voice cut off. Not because he stopped talking, but because no sound came out of his mouth. He kept moving his lips, but the words were gone. Joe grabbed my arm. "We leave now," he said. "All of us. Before they decide we're enemies." But it was too late for that. The spirits surrounded us, dozens of Cherokee people who should have been dead for 150 years. They weren't threatening exactly, but they weren't letting us go either. They watched us with sad, patient eyes, like they were waiting for something. The medicine woman spoke again, and this time I understood her perfectly. Not because I suddenly knew Cherokee, but because her words went straight into my mind. "You have Cherokee blood," she said to me, "Ridgewalker blood. You can learn, you can carry the knowledge forward." "What knowledge?" I asked, surprised that I could speak when Morrison couldn't. She gestured to the glowing plants around us. "The knowledge that died with us, the healing we protected with our lives. It must not be lost again." I looked at Joe, hoping he could help me understand, but he was staring at the spirits with a mixture of awe and terror. "We tried to preserve it," the medicine woman continued. "We stayed here, tending the sacred plants, waiting for someone who could carry the knowledge back to the people. But the years pass, and the plants remain hidden." "What do you want from us?" I asked. Her sad smile chilled me to the bone. "Not all of you," she said. "Only those who can learn, those who can become bridges between the old knowledge and the new world." Morrison finally got his voice back and immediately started yelling about scientific impossibilities and mass hysteria. But Rodriguez and Joe were listening to the spirits, their faces changing as understanding dawned. The medicine woman held out her hand to me. "Come," she said, "let us teach you what was lost." I knew, somehow, that if I took her hand, my life would never be the same. The smart thing would be to run, to get out of the valley while I still could. But those plants glowing around me were the last link to knowledge that had died with my people. Knowledge that could heal, that could help, that could bring the old wisdom back to a world that desperately needed it. I reached out and took her hand. Her skin was cold as creek water and real as my own. The moment we touched, the world exploded into light. The light faded, and I was somewhere else. Not somewhere else in the valley, somewhere else in time. The mist was gone, replaced by clear morning sunlight. The trees looked younger, the creek ran fuller, and the valley was alive with people. Cherokee people, dozens of them, working in vast medicine gardens that covered the entire valley floor. Men and women in traditional dress harvested plants with careful hands, singing as they worked. Children ran between the rows, learning the names and uses of each sacred plant. "This is how it was," the medicine woman said beside me. Her voice was clearer now, younger. "Before the soldiers came, before the burning, I watched the people work, recognizing the patterns they followed, the songs they sang. This was Cherokee medicine at its peak, knowledge built up over thousands of years. My name is Atsila," the medicine woman said. "I was the keeper of this place when the end came." "What happened?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Her face darkened. 1838. The removal soldiers found our hidden valley. We had hoped, we had prayed that the sacred plants would be safe here, but they burned everything. Every garden, every seed, every root. The scene around us changed, and I saw the burning. Soldiers with torches, setting fire to centuries of careful cultivation. Cherokee people, dying as they tried to protect the plants, their blood mixing with the smoke. "We could not let the knowledge die," Atsila said, "so we stayed. We became guardians, keeping the plants alive through spirit power, waiting for someone who could carry the wisdom back to the world." "Why me?" She smiled. "Because you are Ridge Walker's descendant. Your great-grandmother was my student before the burning. She escaped with a few seeds, a few songs. But most of the knowledge died with us. I understood now why the plants in the valley were so perfect, so impossible. The spirits had been tending them for 150 years, keeping them alive through will and memory. "What do you want me to do?" "Learn," she said simply. "Become a bridge between the old knowledge and the new world. Take our teachings back to the Cherokee people." The world shifted again, and suddenly I was standing in a spirit version of the medicine garden, surrounded by ghost teachers who began showing me things no textbook had ever contained. How to read the spiritual energy of plants. How to combine herbs, not just for physical healing, but for healing the soul. How to sing the old songs that made the plants grow strong. Knowledge flooded into my mind faster than I could process it. Plant preparations that could cure diseases modern medicine couldn't touch. Spiritual remedies for trauma and grief. Ways of growing that worked with the earth's energy instead of against it. But with the knowledge came understanding of the price. To carry this wisdom, I would have to change. Become something between the modern world and the ancient one. Never fully belong to either. "I accept," I said. That's when everything went wrong. The spirit world shattered around me like broken glass, and I was back in the real valley with Morrison screaming in my ear. "Where the hell have you been?" he shouted. "You've been standing there for 3 hours, not moving, not responding to anything." 3 hours? It had felt like minutes. But Joe and Rodriguez were staring at me with wide eyes, because I wasn't the same person who had taken Atzila's hand. I could feel the difference in myself, the plant knowledge flowing through my mind like water, the Cherokee words coming easier than English. "She's been chosen," Joe whispered. "They've made her one of them." Morrison grabbed my shoulders, shaking me. "This is mass hysteria. Shared psychosis brought on by isolation. There's no such thing as—" He never finished the sentence. The spirits materialized around us again, but this time they weren't patient. They were angry. Morrison had spent the day destroying their sacred garden, uprooting plants they'd protected for 150 years. Atsila appeared directly in front of him, her eyes blazing with spirit fire. "You have taken without permission," she said. "You have harmed what we died to protect." Morrison tried to back away, but the spirits surrounded him. Not touching, but pressing close, their collective will forcing him to his knees. "This is what happened to us," Atsila said, her voice echoing strangely in the mist. "Soldiers who took without understanding, who destroyed without thought, you will not do the same." "We need to get him out of here," I said, finding my voice. But Joe was shaking his head. "Look at him," he whispered. Morrison's eyes were changing, becoming distant and dreamy. When he spoke, it was in fluent Cherokee. "I understand now," he said in my great-grandmother's language. "The plants are sacred, the knowledge is sacred. I will stay and learn." Rodriguez backed away from him in horror. "What's happening to him?" "They're recruiting him," I realized, "making him into a guardian. The spirits were doing to Morrison what they'd tried to do to me, but without his permission, without his understanding. He was being transformed into something between human and spirit, bound to the valley forever. "Stop this," I said to Atsila. "He doesn't understand what he's agreeing to." "He harmed the sacred plants," she replied. "He must make amends." That's when I understood the real danger. The spirits weren't just trying to preserve knowledge, they were trying to rebuild their community, replace the people who had died protecting the plants. And they weren't going to let any of us leave until they had what they wanted. Morrison was already changing, his skin taking on the translucent quality of the spirits. Soon, he would be like them, tied to the valley, unable to exist anywhere else. I had to make a choice. Use the knowledge they'd given me to fight them, or find another way to save my people. The Cherokee way was always to find balance, to heal, not harm. "I'll make you a deal," I said to Atsila. "Let them go, and I'll stay. I'll help you preserve the knowledge, but in the modern world, I'll teach Cherokee people the old ways. I'll make sure the wisdom doesn't die." Atsila studied me with ancient eyes. "And if the modern world rejects the old knowledge? If they call it superstition? Then I'll prove it works," I said. "I'll show them what Cherokee medicine can do." For a long moment, the valley held its breath. Then Atsila nodded. "You understand the price? You will never be fully human again. The plants will call to you, the spirits will speak through you, you will walk between worlds." "I understand." She touched my forehead, and power flowed between us like lightning. The Cherokee knowledge became truly mine, not just borrowed but embedded in my very soul. Morrison collapsed as the spirit influence left him, gasping and confused but human again. The other spirits began to fade, their forms becoming lighter, more peaceful. "The knowledge is in good hands," Atsila said as she started to disappear. "Use it well, daughter of Ridgewalker." And then they were gone, leaving us alone in a valley that suddenly felt empty and cold. We hiked out of Medicine Creek Basin in silence, each of us lost in our own thoughts. Morrison remembered nothing after entering the garden, though he kept muttering Cherokee words he claimed not to know. Rodriguez documented everything, though I knew no one would believe her reports. Joe walked beside me, occasionally giving me worried looks. "You're different," he said finally. "I can sense it. The plant spirits, they're in you now." He was right. I could feel them, whispers of green knowledge flowing through my mind. When I looked at trees, I saw their medicinal properties glowing like auras. When I touched the ground, I felt the network of roots and fungi connecting every plant in the forest. The spirits had kept their bargain, but they'd made me into something new, something between Cherokee tradition and modern science. We reached the ranger station 3 days later. I filed my official report, documenting the discovery of rare plant specimens and recommending the valley be designated as a protected ethnobotanical preserve. I didn't mention the spirits. Morrison returned to Duke and never spoke publicly about what happened in the valley. But colleagues said he'd developed an uncanny ability to identify medicinal plants by touch, and he'd started incorporating traditional Cherokee remedies into his research. Rodriguez published papers on the unique botanical ecosystem she'd discovered, though she always got nervous when people asked too many questions about how plants could survive in such perfect condition. Joe went back to Cherokee Nation and told the tribal council about Medicine Creek Basin. Within 6 months, they'd established a traditional medicine education program, with me as the primary consultant. That was 5 years ago. Since then, I've trained dozens of Cherokee healers in the old plant knowledge, not the watered-down versions found in books, but the real techniques Atsila taught me. The success rates are remarkable. Chronic illnesses that modern medicine can't touch, responding to plant preparations made according to spirit instructions. The medical establishment calls it placebo effect. The Cherokee Nation calls it the return of ancient wisdom. I call it my life's work. But the price has been real. I can't sleep in cities anymore, too far from the plants that constantly whisper to me. I dream in Cherokee and wake up speaking words I never learned. Sometimes I find myself harvesting plants by moonlight, preparing medicines according to instructions that come from voices only I can hear. I've never married, never had children. The spirits take too much of me for normal human relationships. Last month, I received a call from a Choctaw botanist in Oklahoma. She'd found a hidden valley where extinct medicinal plants were thriving in impossible conditions. plants that should have died out during the removal, growing in perfect health. The strangest part, she said, is that the local elders say they can hear singing at night. Traditional healing songs in languages they thought were lost. I wasn't surprised. The Cherokee weren't the only tribe that hid their sacred knowledge during the removals. Other spirits, other guardians, still protecting what remains of the old wisdom. Would you consult on the site? She asked. We could use someone who understands unusual botanical phenomena. I said yes, of course. It's my job now, walking between worlds, helping the old knowledge find its way back to the people who need it. Tonight I'm packing for Oklahoma, loading my truck with the same botanical equipment I carried into Medicine Creek Basin all those years ago. But I'm also packing traditional Cherokee items that appeared in my cabin without explanation. Medicine bags, grinding stones, bundles of herbs that grow nowhere near North Carolina. Gifts from the spirits, I think. Tools for the work ahead. As I drive away from Cherokee National Forest, I check my rearview mirror one last time. For just a moment, I see a figure standing on the ridge above Medicine Creek Basin. An old Cherokee woman in traditional dress, watching me go with approval in her ancient eyes. At Sela, still keeping watch over the sacred plants. Still making sure the knowledge survives. I wave goodbye and head west toward Oklahoma, toward another hidden valley where the ancestors wait with their whispered secrets. The work continues, the knowledge spreads, and somewhere in the mist-covered mountains of Appalachia, extinct plants bloom in impossible gardens, tended by spirits who died to protect them. If you ever find yourself in a place where the plants grow too perfect, where the mist glows with blue light, where you hear singing in languages you almost remember, approach with respect. The ancestors are listening, and they might just decide you're ready to learn what they died protecting. My name is Samuel Holbrook, but everyone calls me Sam. I've been a park ranger for 22 years, and I thought I'd seen everything these Kentucky mountains had to offer. I was wrong. It was October 1991 when I got the call about the missing research team. 4 people from the University of Kentucky had been studying old mountain songs in the Daniel Boone National Forest. They'd been gone for 3 days, and their families were getting worried. The team had been working in the Bone Creek area, way back in the deep hollows where cell phones don't work, and the nearest road is 25 miles away. Most folks avoid that place. It's got a dark history. During the Civil War, over 200 men died there in guerrilla fighting. Union and Confederate soldiers hunted each other through those hills like animals. I've always been interested in Civil War history. Hell, I even play fiddle at some of the historical events around here. My specialty is the old songs, the ones soldiers used to sing around their campfires. There's something about music that connects you to the past in ways books can't. The missing team was led by Dr. Carol Matthews, a professor who studied folk music. Her notes said they were looking for authentic ballads that went back to the Civil War. They'd heard stories from local families about hearing old songs in the mountains, songs that nobody remembered teaching their kids. I saddled up my horse, Duke, and headed out on the old trail to Bone Creek. The October air was crisp, and fog was starting to roll in between the hills. These mountains can play tricks on you even on a good day. Sound bounces off the rock walls in strange ways, and you can hear things from miles away. About halfway to the camp, Duke started acting up. His ears kept twitching, and he'd stop and look around like he was hearing something I couldn't. Horses are smart that way. They pick up on things we miss. That's when I heard it for the first time. Faint music drifting through the trees. A fiddle playing a slow, sad tune I recognized, Ashokan Farewell. It's a beautiful song, but it wasn't written until the 1,980 seconds for a Civil War documentary. No mountain folk would know it. But here's the thing that made my skin crawl. The fiddle sounded old, really old. Not the bright, clean sound of a modern instrument, but the scratchy, worn tone of something that had been played for decades. And it was coming from the direction of Bone Creek. I urged Duke forward, but he fought me every step. The fog got thicker as we climbed, and the music got clearer. Soon I could hear other instruments joining in, a banjo, a harmonica, maybe a guitar. It sounded like a whole band was playing somewhere up ahead. When I finally reached the research team's camp, I found their tents still standing. Their equipment was scattered around, but not like they'd left in a hurry. It looked more like they'd just stepped away for a minute. Coffee was still in the pot, though it had gone cold. Their notebooks were open, pens lying beside them like someone had been writing and got interrupted. I called out their names, but only my echo came back. The music had stopped the moment I rode into the clearing. That's when I noticed the instruments. Sitting around the cold campfire were 4 instruments that didn't belong to the research team. An old fiddle with a cracked body, a banjo with gut strings instead of metal, a wooden flute worn smooth by years of handling, and a small drum with a head made of what looked like animal skin. These weren't reproductions or replicas. They were the real thing. Instruments that looked like they'd been made in the 1,860 seconds. But they couldn't have been sitting out in the weather for 130 years. They should have been rotted to pieces. I picked up the fiddle. The wood felt warm, like someone had just been playing it. The bow was still rosined, and when I plucked the strings, they were perfectly tuned. That's when Duke spooked and nearly threw me. He was staring at something behind me, his eyes wide with terror. I spun around, but there was nothing there except the fog in the trees. But I could hear voices now. Men singing in harmony, their words too distant to make out. It sounded like a military song. The kind soldiers sang while they marched. The voices were getting closer. I'd never believed in ghosts before that day. I'm a practical man. I believe in what I can see and touch and explain. But as I sat there holding that impossibly preserved fiddle, listening to voices that had no bodies, I started to understand why the research team had disappeared. Something was calling to them from the past, and now it was calling to me. I should have left right then. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to get Duke and ride out of those mountains as fast as I could. But I had a job to do. 4 people were missing, and their families were counting on me to bring them home. I set up my own camp away from the research team's site and tried to think logically. Maybe there was a Civil War reenactment group in the area. Some of those folks take their hobby seriously. They use authentic equipment and camp rough like the original soldiers did. That would explain the instruments and the music. But it didn't explain why my radio only picked up static, or why my compass kept spinning like it couldn't find magnetic north. And it definitely didn't explain what I found when I started searching the area. The first thing was a piece of sheet music stuck on a tree branch about 50 yards from camp. The paper was yellowed and fragile, covered with handwritten notes and faded ink. At the top, someone had written "For the 14th Kentucky Infantry" and dated it the 15th of October, 1862. The song was called "The Ballad of Bone Creek." I'd never heard of it before, but the melody was written out in old-fashioned notation. At the bottom, in different handwriting, someone had added, "Played at the last concert before the ambush. May God forgive us all." The paper should have been destroyed by wind and rain years ago. But it looked like it had been hung there yesterday. I followed a game trail deeper into the hollow, looking for signs of the missing team. The fog was so thick I could barely see 10 feet ahead, but I could hear sounds drifting through it. Footsteps crunching on dead leaves, the jingle of metal equipment, voices talking quietly, like men trying not to be overheard. I called out, thinking it might be the research team. "Dr. Matthews? Can you hear me?" The voices stopped immediately. Then I heard something that made my blood run cold. The sound of dozens of rifles being cocked, all at the same time. I hit the ground and crawled behind a fallen log, my heart pounding. Military training kicked in, even though I'd never served. I knew those sounds. Someone out there was armed and ready for a fight. But as I lay there waiting for something to happen, the fog began to lift slightly. And what I saw didn't make any sense. Men in Civil War uniforms were standing throughout the trees, rifles raised and ready. But they weren't looking at me. They were staring at each other. Union soldiers in blue, facing Confederate soldiers in gray, frozen in a standoff that should have ended 130 years ago. I blinked hard, sure I was seeing things, but when I looked again, they were still there. Dozens of them, maybe more. Some were young, barely out of their teens. Others had gray beards and tired eyes. All of them looked real as life, except for one thing. I could see through them. They stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Then, without any signal I could see, they all lowered their weapons at the same time. The Confederate soldiers tipped their hats to the Union men, who touched their caps in return. Then they all just faded away, like morning mist when the sun hits it. I stayed behind that log until my legs cramped up. When I finally stood, there was no sign anyone had been there. But scattered on the ground were things that shouldn't exist. brass buttons from Civil War uniforms, a few musket balls, and a dented harmonica that looked like it had been dropped in a hurry. I picked up the harmonica and tried to blow a note. The sound that came out was pure and sweet, but it seemed to echo longer than it should have. And when the echo finally died away, I heard something else. A woman's voice, scared and confused. "Hello, is someone there? Please, we need help." It was coming from deeper in the hollow, where the trees grew thick and the shadows stayed dark even in daylight. I grabbed my flashlight and followed the voice, but the fog swallowed the beam after just a few feet. "Dr. Matthews?" I called out. "Where are you?" "Here." The voice was closer now. "We're by the old camp." I pushed through the undergrowth, following the sound. Branches caught at my clothes and scratched my face, but I kept going. I had to find them. Then I stumbled into a clearing I'd never seen before, even though I'd been exploring these mountains for 20 years. It was bigger than the research team's camp, with the remains of what looked like military tents scattered around. But these weren't modern camping tents. These were Civil War-era canvas shelters, the kind soldiers lived in during long campaigns. And sitting by a campfire that gave off no heat was Dr. Carol Matthews. At least, it looked like her. She was wearing a long dress instead of the hiking clothes she'd been reported missing in. Her hair was done up in an old-fashioned style, and she was playing a dulcimer that hadn't been in her equipment list. "Dr. Matthews?" I approached carefully. "Are you all right?" She looked up at me with confused eyes. "I'm sorry, do I know you? Are you with the regiment?" "I'm Sam Holbrook, park ranger. Your family reported you missing. We need to get you out of here." She tilted her head like she was trying to remember something important. "Missing? But I can't leave. The concert is tonight. The boys are counting on me to play for them." She gestured around the empty clearing. "They've been fighting so long, and music is all they have left to remind them of home." That's when I realized Dr. Matthews wasn't alone. The clearing was full of transparent figures in Civil War uniforms. They sat on logs and stumps, some cleaning rifles, others writing letters by candlelight that cast no shadows. And they were all watching me with eyes that held too much sadness for any living person to bear. I was looking at the dead, and somehow, Dr. Carol Matthews had become one of them. I tried to stay calm, but everything I thought I knew about the world was falling apart. Dead people don't have conversations. They don't play music or sit around campfires. They sure as hell don't recruit living professors to give concerts. But there I was, talking to a woman who should have been alive but was acting like she'd been dead for over a century. "Dr. Matthews, listen to me," I said, keeping my voice steady. "You're a music professor from the University of Kentucky. You came here with 3 other people to study folk songs. Do you remember?" She frowned, and for a moment something flickered in her eyes, confusion, maybe even recognition. But then one of the ghost soldiers stood up and walked over to us. He was young, maybe 19, with a scraggly beard and a uniform that was more patches than original cloth. "Ma'am," he said to Dr. Matthews, touching the brim of his cap, "begging your pardon, but the captain wants to know if you're ready for evening parade. The boys have been looking forward to some music all day." Dr. Matthews smiled at him like he was completely real. "Of course, Private Williams. Just let me finish tuning my instrument." The ghost soldier nodded and walked away. I watched him go, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. He moved like a living person, talked like a living person, even cast a faint shadow on the ground. But I could see the trees through his body. "You can see them too," Dr. Matthews said. "That's why you're here, isn't it? You have the gift." "I don't have any gift," I said. "I just need to get you and your team out of these mountains. Where are the others?" She looked around the camp with sad eyes. Dr. Peterson joined the cavalry unit up on the ridge. He was always fascinated by horses. And Dr. Chen, well, she's with the medical course now. They needed someone who understood anatomy. My stomach dropped. "What about Tom Wilson, the graduate student?" "Oh, Tommy," she laughed, but there was no humor in it. "He tried to leave. Poor boy ran all the way to the creek before they caught him. Now he's on picket duty with the scouts. They don't trust him yet, but they will eventually." I was starting to understand what had happened. Somehow, the spirits of Civil War soldiers were still here, still fighting their war. And they were recruiting the living to fill their ranks. "Dr. Matthews, these men are dead. They died in 1862. You need to come with me right now." She shook her head. That's impossible. Look at them. They're right here talking to us. How can they be dead? As if summoned by her words, a tall man in a captain's uniform approached our fire. He had a full beard and eyes that had seen too much violence. When he spoke, his voice had the authority of someone used to being obeyed. "Evening, miss," he said to Dr. Matthews. Then he turned to me. "Don't believe we've been introduced. Captain James Morrison, 14th Kentucky Infantry." I didn't know what else to do, so I answered, "Sam Holbrook. I'm a park ranger." "Ah, a scout," he nodded approvingly. "We can always use good scouts. These mountains are full of guerrillas and bushwhackers. Can't be too careful." The captain looked real as anyone I'd ever met. When he extended his hand, I actually reached out to shake it before I caught myself. But when our hands would have touched, mine passed right through his. He didn't seem to notice. "We're having a bit of a musical evening tonight. Miss Carroll here has been teaching the boys some new songs. You're welcome to join us, Mr. Holbrook. Music is good for morale, and God knows we need all the morale we can get." The ghost soldiers around the camp started moving with purpose. Some brought out instruments, fiddles, banjos, harmonicas, and drums. Others arranged logs in a circle around the fire. Within minutes, they had set up what looked like a proper concert. Dr. Matthews took her place in the center with her dulcimer. The phantom soldiers gathered around, their faces eager for entertainment. And then she started to play. The music was beautiful and heartbreaking. Old ballads about home and family, war songs that spoke of honor and sacrifice, mournful tunes about friends who would never return. The ghost soldiers sang along in perfect harmony, their voices creating echoes that seemed to bounce off the mountains themselves. But as the concert went on, I noticed something terrible. Dr. Matthews was becoming more transparent. With each song she played, she looked less solid, less real. She was becoming like them. I had to get her out of there before it was too late. When the music stopped, I stood up. "Captain Morrison, I need to take Miss Carroll back to her own camp. She has other duties." The captain's eyes narrowed. "I'm afraid that's not possible, Mr. Holbrook. Miss Carroll has enlisted in our cause. She's one of us now. She's not a soldier, she's a civilian." "We're all soldiers here," he said firmly. "Every man, woman, and child in these mountains is either with us or against us. There's no middle ground in war." The other ghost soldiers started standing up, hands moving to weapons that shouldn't exist but somehow did. I realized I was in serious trouble. That's when I heard a scream from somewhere in the darkness beyond the camp. It was a man's voice, raw with terror. One of the missing researchers, it had to be. The scream came again, closer this time, and I could make out words. "Let me go, please, I want to go home." Captain Morrison sighed. "Private Wilson, still causing trouble. Sergeant, would you please retrieve our wayward scout?" A burly ghost in a sergeant's stripes nodded and disappeared into the trees. A few minutes later, he returned, dragging a young man who was definitely alive but looked like he'd been through hell. It was Tom Wilson, the graduate student. His clothes were torn and dirty, and there were dark circles under his eyes like he hadn't slept in days. But the worst part was the look of absolute desperation on his face. "Dr. Matthews," he cried when he saw her. "Thank God, we have to get out of here. These people, they're not people at all." Dr. Matthews looked at him with pity. "Poor Tommy, you're still confused. These are good men fighting for their country. Once you accept that, you'll be much happier." "They're dead," Tom shouted. "They've been dead for over 100 years. The ghost soldiers muttered angrily at that. Captain Morrison raised his hand for silence. "Private Wilson," he said coldly, "you will show proper respect for your fellow soldiers, or you will face disciplinary action." Tom turned to me, hope flickering in his eyes. "You're real, right? You're not one of them? Please tell me you're here to rescue us." I nodded. "I'm here to take you all home." But even as I said it, I could feel the weight of dozens of phantom eyes on me. The ghost soldiers had closed ranks around us, cutting off any escape route. And Captain Morrison was watching me with an expression that said he wasn't about to let anyone leave his regiment. "I'm afraid you misunderstand the situation, Mr. Holbrook," the captain said. "No one leaves Bone Creek. This is where we make our stand. This is where we hold the line." He gestured to the mountains around us. "We've been fighting here for 130 years, and we'll keep fighting until the war is won. And now that we have new recruits to fill our ranks, we might actually have a chance." That's when I realized the horrible truth. These weren't just random ghost soldiers hanging around an old battlefield. They were trapped here, doomed to keep fighting a war that had ended decades before I was born. And they planned to trap us too. The only question was whether I could find a way to break their supernatural hold before I ended up as dead as they were. The ghost soldiers formed a circle around us, and I could feel the temperature dropping fast. My breath came out in white puffs, and frost started forming on the grass, even though it was October in Kentucky. Tom Wilson grabbed my arm. "They don't let anyone leave," he whispered. "I've tried a dozen times. Every time I get to the edge of the hollow, I just end up back here. It's like the whole place is a trap." Captain Morrison heard him. "It's not a trap, Private, it's duty. These mountains are our responsibility. We swore an oath to defend this ground, and we'll keep that oath until our last breath." "You took your last breath in 1862, I said. "The war is over. The Union won, slavery was ended, and the country moved on." The captain's face darkened. "The war is never over, Mr. Holbrook. Not as long as there are men willing to fight for what they believe in." He gestured to the phantom soldiers around us. "Look at these men, blue and gray, Union and Confederate. In life, they were enemies. They killed each other in these very hills. But in death, they've found something more important than politics." "What's that?" "Brotherhood. The brotherhood of soldiers who understand that some things are worth dying for." Dr. Matthews nodded agreement. "The music helps them remember their humanity. That's why they need musicians. War makes men into animals, but music makes them human again." I was starting to understand. These weren't vengeful ghosts looking for revenge. They were soldiers who couldn't let go of their duty, their loyalty to each other, and their need to keep fighting. Death hadn't released them from their oaths. But understanding them didn't mean I was going to join them. "Where's the fourth member of the research team?" I asked. "Dr. Chen?" Captain Morrison pointed toward a tent on the far side of the camp. "She's tending to our wounded. We have many boys who never received proper medical care." I walked over to the tent, the ghost soldiers parting to let me pass. Inside, I found Dr. Susan Chen working over a phantom soldier who had taken a musket ball to the shoulder. She was using modern surgical techniques, but somehow her hands could touch the ghost's transparent flesh. "Dr. Chen?" I said softly. She looked up at me with eyes that were already starting to look distant, like Dr. Matthews. "Are you wounded? I can have a look at you in just a moment." "I'm fine. I'm here to take you home." She smiled sadly. "This is my home now. These boys have been suffering for so long without proper medical care. How can I abandon them?" The wounded ghost soldier reached up and touched her hand. "Thank you, Doc," he said. "First time the pain's been manageable in 130 years." I realized that Dr. Chen was actually healing them somehow. Her modern medical knowledge was giving them relief they'd never found in death. "Dr. Chen, listen to me. You're being trapped here. These soldiers are dead. You can't help them forever." "Why not?" she asked. "If I can ease their suffering, isn't that my duty as a doctor?" Before I could answer, shouting erupted from outside the tent. I rushed out to find chaos in the camp. The ghost soldiers were grabbing their weapons and forming battle lines. Captain Morrison was shouting orders. "Guerrillas in the North Pass. All units, prepare for engagement." Tom Wilson grabbed my sleeve. "They do this every night," he said frantically. "They fight the same battle over and over again. And they want us to fight with them." Sure enough, the phantom soldiers were pressing Civil War-era rifles and sabers into our hands. The weapons felt solid and real, but they were ice-cold to the touch. "I won't fight in your war," I told Captain Morrison. "I won't kill people for a cause I don't believe in." "You don't have a choice," the captain replied grimly. "Every man must choose a side. Neutrality is just another word for cowardice." The sound of gunfire echoed through the mountains. But these weren't modern weapons. These were the deep booms of muskets and the sharp crack of Civil War-era rifles. Somehow, the Battle of Bone Creek was still being fought, night after night, by men who couldn't accept that they were dead. "This has to stop," I said. Captain Morrison turned to me with eyes full of pain. "Do you think we want this? Do you think we enjoy an eternity of war? We're trapped here, Mr. Holbrook. Bound by oaths we can never break, fighting for causes that died with us. Then break the oaths. Lay down your weapons. Let yourselves rest." "We tried," he whispered. "God knows we tried. But every time we attempt to leave, we remember our duty, our loyalty to each other, the promises we made to defend this ground with our lives. That's when I understood what was really happening. These soldiers weren't evil or vengeful. They were trapped by their own honor, their own sense of duty and brotherhood. They couldn't abandon each other, even in death. What if there was another way? I asked. What if you could be released from your oaths? The captain looked at me with desperate hope. How? I thought about my own background, my knowledge of Civil War history and military tradition. There was one thing that could release a soldier from his oath of service. An honorable discharge, I said, signed by a proper authority. Captain Morrison shook his head. Our officers are dead. Our government is gone. Who has the authority to discharge us now? I took a deep breath. I do. I'm a federal employee, a representative of the United States government. The same government your Union soldiers swore to serve, and the government that reunited the country your Confederate soldiers fought to preserve in their own way. The ghost soldiers stopped moving. Even the sound of distant gunfire faded away. Every phantom eye was focused on me. I have the authority to officially end your service, I continued, to release you from your oaths with honor intact. But you have to let my people go, all of them. Captain Morrison studied my face for a long moment. You would do that? You would give us what we've wanted for over a century? I would. But first, Dr. Matthews, Dr. Chen, and Tom Wilson come with me. No arguments, no delays. The captain nodded slowly. Agreed. But the discharge ceremony must be proper. Military protocol must be observed. Of course. I spent the next hour arranging the most surreal military ceremony of my life. The ghost soldiers formed perfect ranks while I stood at attention in front of them. Dr. Matthews, Dr. Chen, and Tom Wilson stood beside me, looking confused but hopeful. Using my authority as a federal park ranger and my knowledge of military tradition, I formally discharged every soldier from their eternal service. I read their names from records that appeared out of thin air. I thanked them for their sacrifice and declared their duty complete. One by one, the ghost soldiers laid down their weapons. As they did, they began to fade. But their faces showed peace for the first time in 130 years. Captain Morrison was the last to go. Thank you, he said simply. We can finally rest. As the last phantom soldier disappeared, the oppressive atmosphere lifted from the hollow. The instruments scattered around the camp crumbled to dust. The military equipment rusted away in seconds, and Dr. Matthews, Dr. Chen, and Tom Wilson blinked like people waking up from a long dream. We made it out of the mountains just as dawn broke over the ridges. Dr. Matthews and Dr. Chen remembered everything that had happened, but it felt distant to them now, like a vivid dream they were already starting to forget. Tom Wilson was shaken, but physically unharmed. The fourth team member, Dr. Peterson, we found 3 days later. He was discovered by another search party, sitting peacefully by a stream about 10 miles from Bone Creek. He had no memory of the past week and insisted he'd just been enjoying the solitude of the mountains. The doctors said he was suffering from exhaustion and dehydration, but otherwise fine. I never told anyone the complete truth about what happened in those mountains. Who would believe it? Instead, I filed a report about the team getting disoriented in the fog and separated from each other. Happens more often than people think in terrain like that. But I kept the harmonica I'd found. Sometimes, late at night, I take it out and play a few notes. The sound is still sweet and pure, but now it makes me feel peaceful instead of scared. I like to think it's a reminder that even the dead can find rest if someone's willing to help them. The Daniel Boone National Forest established a Civil War memorial at Bone Creek 6 months later. It's a simple stone marker that lists the names of all the soldiers who died there, Union and Confederate alike. The inscription reads, "In honor of all who served with courage and died with honor." I was there for the dedication ceremony. As the chaplain finished his prayer and the crowd started to leave, I could have sworn I heard faint music drifting through the trees. A gentle melody played on instruments I couldn't see. But it wasn't sad or haunting anymore. It sounded like a song of gratitude. Dr. Matthews went back to her university and published a paper on the folk music traditions of Appalachian Civil War veterans. She never mentioned the supernatural experiences, but her work helped preserve dozens of songs that might have been lost forever. She sends me a Christmas card every year with a note that always says the same thing. Thanks for helping us find our way home. Tom Wilson changed his major from musicology to military history. He's working on his doctorate now, focusing on the psychological effects of war on soldiers. He calls me sometimes to talk about trauma and healing. I think what happened to him in those mountains gave him a deeper understanding of what war really costs. Dr. Chen left academia and became a trauma surgeon. She says she feels called to help people who are suffering. I have a feeling she'll be very good at her job. As for me, I still patrol these mountains, but I see them differently now. Every hollow has its stories. Every ridge has its ghosts. Most of them are peaceful. Just echoes of the past that don't mean any harm. But I keep my ears open for the troubled ones. The spirits who are trapped by duty or guilt or love and can't find their way to rest. Because I learned something important in Bone Creek. The dead don't want to haunt us. They want to be remembered, honored, and released. And sometimes, the living are the only ones who can give them that peace. I still hear music in the mountains sometimes. But now I know what it means. It's not a call for help or a warning of danger. It's just the sound of old soldiers singing themselves to sleep, finally able to rest after a war that lasted far too long. If you ever find yourself hiking in the deep hollows of Kentucky and you hear the faint sound of a fiddle or the distant echo of men singing, don't be afraid. Just stop for a moment. Listen respectfully and remember that some melodies are too beautiful to die, even when their musicians have been gone for more than a century. The mountains remember everything, and sometimes, if you listen carefully, they'll share their songs with you. My name is Ezekiel Shepard, but everyone calls me Zeke. I've been a park ranger for 17 years now, working the Jefferson National Forest in Virginia. Most folks think being a ranger is all about preventing forest fires and helping lost hikers, but my specialty is a bit different. I handle what we call heritage sites, old places with history that goes deep into these mountains. I wasn't always a ranger. Before this job, I spent 3 years in seminary school, studying to be a preacher. That didn't work out the way I planned. But those years learning about religion and faith turned out to be useful in ways I never expected. These Appalachian mountains are full of old churches, forgotten cemeteries, and places where people used to gather to worship in their own way. December in the mountains is no joke. The year was 1988, and we'd been hit with one of the worst winter storms in recent memory. Snow piled up 3 feet deep in some places, and the wind cut through your jacket like it was made of paper. That's when the call came in about Mount Sinai. We got a situation up on Mount Sinai Peak, my supervisor told me over the radio. Religious studies team from Virginia Tech went up there 3 days ago to document some old church ruins. Haven't heard from them since. Mount Sinai was 30 miles from the nearest town, accessible only by a narrow mountain trail that turned deadly in winter weather. The peak held the ruins of an old church from the 1800s, along with a small cemetery. Local families still talked about it sometimes, though most preferred not to. I knew the history. In 1889, Mount Sinai Church had been the center of a religious revival movement. People came from all over to hear preacher Samuel Hartwell deliver his passionate sermons. But not everyone liked his style of worship. Some called it too enthusiastic, too loud, too different from proper church services. On Christmas Eve 1889, someone set fire to the church during the evening service. 23 people died that night, including preacher Hartwell. The fire happened so fast that most of the congregation was trapped inside. After that, people avoided the mountain. They said it was cursed. I loaded up my truck with winter survival gear, emergency medical supplies, and my documentation equipment. My master's degree in comparative religion, with a focus on Appalachian spirituality, meant I understood these old sites better than most rangers. I'd also trained as a wilderness chaplain and grief counselor, MCS, skills that came in handy when dealing with families who'd lost loved ones in the mountains. The drive up to Mount Sinai took 2 hours in good weather. In this storm, it took 4. The higher I climbed, the worse the wind got. By the time I reached the base trail, snow was coming down so hard I could barely see 10 feet ahead. I radioed base station. "This is Ranger Shepard. I'm at the Mount Sinai trailhead. Visibility is near zero, but I'm proceeding to the summit. Copy that, Zeke. Check in every hour. If we don't hear from you, we're sending backup. The hike up took another hour and a half. The trail was treacherous, covered in ice and hidden by deep snow drifts. Twice I had to use my rope to pull myself up particularly steep sections. The whole time, the wind howled through the trees like something alive and angry. When I finally reached the summit, I stopped and stared. The church ruins sat in a natural clearing, surrounded by tall pine trees that blocked some of the wind. What was left of the building was mostly stone foundation and a few partial walls. The bell tower had collapsed decades ago. Next to the church was the old cemetery, with weathered headstones poking up through the snow like broken teeth. But something felt wrong about the place. I couldn't put my finger on it at first. Maybe it was just the storm, or being alone on a mountain in the middle of winter. But the wrongness went deeper than that. I set up my emergency shelter in the lee of the largest remaining wall and started looking for signs of the missing research team. Their vehicles weren't at the base of the mountain, which meant they'd either left or something else had happened to them. That's when I found the first strange thing. Scattered around the church ruins were fresh flowers. Not old flowers that had been there for days, but fresh ones, daisies and mountain laurel that shouldn't have been blooming in December. And they weren't frozen, despite the below-freezing temperature. I picked up one of the flowers and examined it closely. It was warm to the touch. I spent the first hour doing what any good ranger would do, documenting everything methodically. I took photos of the site, measured the temperature, which was a steady 15 degrees Fahrenheit, and noted wind patterns. The storm was getting worse, which meant I'd likely be spending the night on the mountain, whether I wanted to or not. That's when I found the research team's equipment. Their camp was set up about 50 yards from the church ruins, in a spot that should have provided good shelter. 3 tents, a portable weather station, and enough gear for a week-long stay. But the tents were empty, and everything was arranged too neatly. Sleeping bags were rolled up perfectly, equipment was stacked in precise piles, and there were no signs of a struggle or hurried departure. Inside one tent, I found their research notes. Dr. Hannah Cross, Dr. Jennifer White, and Dr. Michael Torres from Virginia Tech's Religious Studies Department. They'd come to study what they called temporal religious manifestations and miraculous structural restoration phenomena. Whatever that meant. Dr. Cross had written in her notebook, Day 1, church appears intact during certain weather conditions. Building shows signs of recent use despite being ruins for 100 years. Investigating further. Day 2, heard singing last night around 11 p.m. Beautiful harmonies, definitely human voices, but saw no one. Dr. White recorded approximately 45 minutes of what appears to be authentic 1,880 seconds. Methodist hymns. Source unknown. Day 3. Something impossible is happening here. Need to document everything before. The entry ended there, mid-sentence, as if she'd been interrupted. I was reading her notes when I heard it. Singing. It was faint at first, nearly drowned out by the wind. But as I stood perfectly still and listened, I could make out distinct human voices raised in harmony. The melody was old-fashioned, something I recognized from my seminary days. An old Methodist hymn called Come, Thou Fount of Every Blessing. The singing was coming from the direction of the church ruins. I grabbed my flashlight and headed toward the sound, following proper procedure by radioing my position to base station. This is Ranger Shepard. I'm investigating possible survivors near the church site. We'll report back in 30 minutes. The closer I got to the ruins, the clearer the singing became. But I still couldn't see anyone. The church had no roof and only partial walls. There was nowhere for a group of singers to hide from the storm. Then I saw the light. Warm, golden light was spilling out of the church ruins, as if there were windows and candles and people inside. But I could see through the broken walls. The church was empty. I stopped about 20 feet away and called out, "Hello, is anyone there? This is Park Ranger Shepard. I'm here to help." The singing stopped immediately. The light went out, and in the sudden darkness, I heard a man's voice, deep and resonant, speaking with an old-fashioned accent. "Welcome, brother. We've been waiting for you to join our service." I swept my flashlight beam across the church ruins. They were definitely empty, just snow-covered stone and collapsed timber. But the voice had been real. I was certain of that. "Who's there?" I called out. "Where are you?" No response. I approached the church slowly, my boots crunching in the snow. When I reached the foundation, I climbed over the broken wall and stood where the altar would have been. My flashlight revealed nothing but ruins covered in snow. But the snow wasn't right. Inside the church foundation, the snow was arranged in rows, as if invisible people had been sitting in pews. And at what would have been the front of the church, the snow was disturbed in the shape of a pulpit. I knelt down and brushed away some of the snow from one of the pew areas. Underneath, I found a hymnal. Not an old, weather-beaten book, but a hymnal that looked like it had been printed yesterday. The pages were crisp and white, and when I opened it, the book fell open to "Come, Thou Fount of Every Blessing," the exact hymn I'd heard being sung. That's when I found Dr. Hannah Cross. She was sitting in what would have been the back pew, if there had been pews. But she was sitting on empty air, about 2 feet off the ground, her back straight as if she were in an actual church service. Her eyes were open, but she wasn't seeing me. She was staring toward the front of the ruins with an expression of peaceful devotion. "Dr. Cross," I said, approaching her carefully. "Dr. Cross, can you hear me?" She turned her head slowly to look at me, and when she spoke, her voice had the same old-fashioned accent I'd heard before. "Shush now, brother. The preacher is about to begin his sermon. We've been waiting such a long time to hear the word." I checked her pulse. It was steady but slow, and her skin felt warm despite the freezing temperature. She was alive, but something was very wrong. "Where are the other researchers?" I asked. "Dr. White and Dr. Torres?" Dr. Cross smiled peacefully. "They're here for the service, of course. We're all here. The whole congregation is here, just like it should be." But I was looking at empty space. Except for Dr. Cross, the church ruins were completely empty. That's when the singing started again. This time, the singing was coming from all around me. Not just from the front of the church, but from every direction, as if I were surrounded by an invisible choir. The voices were beautiful, men, women, and children singing in perfect harmony, but I could see no one except Dr. Cross, who had turned back toward the front of the ruins and was mouthing the words to the hymn. The temperature inside the church foundation began to rise. Not dramatically, but enough that I could feel the difference. My breath stopped forming clouds, and the snow under my feet started to soften. I tried my radio. "Base station, this is Ranger Shepard. I've found one of the missing researchers. She's alive but in some kind of altered state. I need immediate medical evacuation." Static answered me. Then, cutting through the static, I heard a man's voice, the same deep voice I'd heard before. "No need for outside help, brother. Everything you need is right here with us." The radio went dead. I grabbed Dr. Cross by the shoulders, gently but firmly. "Dr. Cross, we need to leave. There's a storm coming, and you need medical attention." She looked at me with confusion, as if she couldn't understand why I wanted to leave. "But the service isn't over. Preacher Hartwell hasn't finished his sermon yet. We can't leave until the service is over." Preacher Hartwell, the man who died in the 1889 fire. I looked toward the front of the ruins, where Dr. Cross was staring. The snow there was beginning to shift and move, forming shapes. For just a moment, I could swear I saw the outline of a man in dark clothing, standing behind a wooden pulpit. But when I blinked, there was nothing but snow and broken stone. "Dr. Cross," I said urgently, "Preacher Hartwell died almost 100 years ago. This is 1988. You're a professor at Virginia Tech, and you came here to do research. Do you remember?" She shook her head sadly. "You're confused, brother. Time works differently on God's mountain. The preacher is right here, and the service is about to begin." That's when I heard footsteps. Heavy boots walking across wooden floorboards. Even though there were no floorboards, the footsteps moved from the back of the church toward the front, passing right by where I was standing. I felt the vibration of each step through the ground. And then I heard the voice again, clear as day. "Brothers and sisters, let us bow our heads in prayer before we begin tonight's service. Lord, we thank you for bringing new members to our congregation." Dr. Cross immediately bowed her head and folded her hands in her lap. And despite every rational part of my mind screaming at me to run, I found myself wanting to bow my head too. The voice was so warm, so welcoming, so full of genuine faith and love. I forced myself to stay alert and started backing toward the church wall. But as I moved, I heard more footsteps. Dozens of them. The ruins filled with the sound of people settling into wooden pews, coughing softly, whispering prayers. The sounds of a congregation preparing for worship. The temperature continued to rise. Now it felt like a warm spring evening instead of a freezing December night, and I started to smell things that shouldn't have been there. Wood smoke from a fireplace, flowers, candle wax, and the faint scent of old books. That's when I found Dr. Michael Torres. He was lying on his side near what would have been the north wall of the church, but he wasn't on the ground. He was lying on something invisible, a wooden pew, from the way his body was positioned. His eyes were closed, and his breathing was shallow. When I knelt beside him, I saw burn marks on his clothing. Not recent burns, but old ones, as if his coat had been singed by flames that had died out long ago. The strange thing was, his modern winter jacket showed the burn patterns, but underneath, his skin was unmarked. "Dr. Torres," I whispered, shaking his shoulder gently. "Can you hear me?" His eyes opened slowly, and when they focused on me, they were filled with terror. Unlike Dr. Cross, he seemed fully aware of where he was and what was happening. "Get out," he whispered urgently. "Get out now, before you become part of it. They're trying to complete the service. They need a full congregation." "What happened to you?" "I tried to leave last night. Made it almost to the tree line before the fire caught up with me. But it wasn't real fire. It was memory fire. Fire from 1889, still burning." Before I could ask him more, the preaching began. The voice that filled the ruins was rich and powerful, with the cadence of a man who'd spent his life delivering sermons. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here on this holy mountain to worship the Lord and find strength for the trials ahead." I looked toward the front of the church and gasped. A man was standing behind a wooden pulpit that definitely hadn't been there a moment before. He was tall and thin, wearing a black suit and white collar that marked him as a preacher. His face was kind but weathered, and his eyes burned with religious fervor. Behind him, the entire church had been restored. Stone walls rose to support a wooden roof. Stained glass windows let in warm, colored light. Oil lamps hung from iron brackets, casting everything in a golden glow. And filling every pew was a congregation of men, women, and children, dressed in 1880 clothing. They sat perfectly still, their hands folded, their faces turned toward the preacher with expressions of devoted attention. Dr. Cross was no longer sitting on empty air. She was sitting in an actual wooden pew, and her modern winter clothing had been replaced by a long dress and bonnet that matched what the other women in the congregation were wearing. "No," I breathed, backing toward the wall. But when I looked behind me, the wall was gone. I was inside a complete, fully functional church, and the only way out was through the congregation. Preacher Hartwell's eyes found mine across the church. He smiled warmly and gestured for me to take a seat. "Welcome, Brother Shepherd," he said, somehow knowing my name. "We've been waiting for you to join us. Please, take a seat. The service is about to begin, and we have so much to discuss about faith and sacrifice and the bonds that tie us to holy ground." Dr. Torres grabbed my arm. "Don't sit down," he whispered. "Whatever you do, don't sit down. Once you take a seat, you become part of the congregation, part of the service that can never end." I understood then what was happening, and the knowledge hit me like a punch to the stomach. The congregation that died in the 1889 fire hadn't left Mount Sinai. They were still here, still trying to complete the Christmas Eve service that had been interrupted by flames and hatred. But they needed living people to fill out their ranks, to make the service complete. "Dr. Torres," I whispered, "where's Dr. White?" He pointed toward the front of the church with a shaking hand. Dr. Jennifer White was sitting in the front pew, wearing a blue dress from the 1880. Like Dr. Cross, she was staring at Preacher Hartwell with devoted attention, completely unaware of me or Dr. Torres. The preacher continued his sermon, and his words were beautiful. He spoke about faith in the face of persecution, about standing strong when others tried to destroy what you believed in, about love conquering hate, and how sacred ground could never truly be destroyed. I found myself listening, drawn in by his voice and his message. Part of me, the part that had once studied for the ministry, recognized the truth in his words. These people had died for their faith, killed by those who couldn't tolerate their way of worshiping. "Brother Shepherd," Preacher Hartwell called out, interrupting his sermon to address me directly. "I know your heart is troubled. I know you left the ministry because you doubted your calling. But you were meant to be here, on this mountain, in this moment. Your ancestor was among those who set the fire that killed us." The words hit me like a physical blow. "That's impossible. Jeremiah Shepherd," the preacher continued, "your great-great-grandfather, he was among the men who decided our worship was too enthusiastic, too emotional, too different from what they considered proper. He helped pour the coal oil that fed the flames. Memories I'd buried came flooding back. Family stories about an ancestor who'd been involved in religious troubles in the mountains. Stories my grandmother had told me about how the Shepherd family had carried guilt for generations about something that happened at an old mountain church. "You carry his guilt," Preacher Hartwell said gently, "and his debt, but you also carry the chance for redemption. Help us complete our service, Brother Shepherd. Help us find the peace we've been seeking for 100 years." Dr. Torres was pulling on my arm, trying to get me to move toward what he thought was the exit. But I could see what he couldn't. The walls around us weren't real walls. They were made of memory and faith and the desperate need of souls who died protecting what they believed in. "What do you want?" I asked the preacher. "Only what we've always wanted," he replied. "To finish our Christmas Eve service. To sing our hymns, share our prayers, and celebrate the birth of our Lord. When the service is complete, we can rest. And if I help you, what happens to the people from Virginia Tech?" Preacher Hartwell's expression grew sad. "Those who've joined our congregation willingly can leave when the service ends. Those who've resisted," he gestured toward Dr. Torres, whose burn marks were becoming more visible as I watched. I realized I had a choice to make. I could try to fight my way out of the church, probably losing Dr. Torres and maybe the other researchers in the process. Or I could do what the congregation needed, help them complete their interrupted service and find peace. But there was a third option, one that my years of seminary training had prepared me for, even though I hadn't realized it at the time. "Preacher Hartwell," I said, standing up and facing him directly, "your congregation has been waiting a long time for proper closure. You deserve to complete your service with dignity and respect. But these researchers aren't part of your original congregation. They came here as visitors, as guests." The preacher nodded slowly. "That's true. In the Methodist tradition, guests are always welcome to participate in worship, but they're never required to join the congregation permanently. Isn't that right?" A murmur went through the phantom congregation. They remembered. They knew I was right. "You're a smart young man, Brother Shepherd," Preacher Hartwell said with a slight smile. "Yes, that's our tradition. Guests may worship with us, but they choose whether to join us permanently." "Then let me propose this," I said, my heart pounding. "Let me help you complete your service properly. Let me stand in as your assistant pastor, using the training I received in seminary. We'll complete the Christmas Eve service the way it should have been completed in 1889. But when it's done, when you've had your proper worship and your proper closure, you let the visitors leave." The preacher was quiet for a long moment. Around the church, the congregation waited for his answer. "And you, Brother Shepherd, you carry your ancestors' debt. Are you willing to stay and join us permanently?" I looked around the church, at Dr. Cross and Dr. White sitting peacefully in their pews, at Dr. Torres with his burn marks, at the faces of people who died nearly a century ago for the crime of worshiping differently. "I'll stay if that's what's required," I said, "but I'd like to ask for something else instead." "What would you ask?" "Let me carry your story back to the world below. Let me make sure people remember what happened here, not as a curse or a haunting, but as a tragedy that should never be repeated. Let me help build something here that honors your memory properly." The congregation was murmuring now, and I could hear hope in their voices. They wanted to be remembered. They wanted their deaths to mean something more than just tragedy. Preacher Hartwell stepped down from the pulpit and walked over to where I was standing. Up close, I could see the marks of the fire that had killed him, but his eyes were kind and full of wisdom. "You would do this? You would see that we're remembered with respect?" "Yes, sir. I give you my word." He smiled then, and the expression transformed his whole face. "Then let us complete our service, Brother Shepherd. Help me give my congregation the Christmas Eve worship they died protecting." What followed was the most beautiful and terrifying hour of my life. I stood beside Preacher Hartwell as he completed the sermon he'd been trying to finish for 100 years. The congregation sang hymns in voices that soared to the rafters. We shared communion using bread and wine that tasted real, but left no trace when the service ended. I read from Scripture, passages about love conquering hate, about faith surviving persecution, about the promise that death could not separate the faithful from their God. My seminary training came back to me as if I'd never left school, and I found myself preaching with a passion I'd never felt before. When the service ended, Preacher Hartwell turned to the congregation and spoke the words they'd been waiting a century to hear. Go in peace, knowing that your faith was true, your worship was valid, and your sacrifice was not in vain. Rest now in the love of God. One by one, the members of the congregation stood and walked toward the front of the church. As they reached the altar, they faded away like morning mist. But each one turned to smile at me before disappearing. Men, women, and children who died for their faith finally found their peace. When the last congregation member had gone, the church began to fade around us. The walls became transparent, the roof dissolved, and the pews turned back into snow-covered ground. Dr. Cross, Dr. White, and Dr. Torres were sitting in the snow, wearing their modern clothes again, looking confused but unharmed. The burn marks on Dr. Torres's jacket had disappeared. Preacher Hartwell was the last to go. He placed a hand on my shoulder and said, "Thank you, Brother Shepherd. You've given us the greatest gift, the chance to finish what we started and find our rest." "What should I tell people about this place?" I asked. "Tell them it's holy ground," he said. "Tell them that faith and love are stronger than hate and fear, and tell them that some stories need to be remembered, not forgotten." Then he was gone, and I was alone on the mountain with 3 confused researchers and the ruins of an old church. The storm had passed while we were inside the phantom church. The sky was clear, and morning light was breaking over the mountain peaks. I radioed for evacuation, and within a few hours, we were all back at base camp. The researchers remembered their experiences differently. Dr. Cross thought she'd had vivid dreams about attending a beautiful church service. Dr. White recalled hearing amazing music but couldn't explain where it came from. Dr. Torres was the only one who remembered it clearly, and he backed up my official report completely. That was 6 months ago. Since then, I've been working with the Jefferson National Forest Administration, local churches, and historical societies to create something special on Mount Sinai. We're building an interfaith memorial chapel that honors religious freedom and tolerance. The chapel will sit next to the original church ruins, and it will be a place where people of all faiths can come to worship and remember. The state has recognized Mount Sinai as a historical site, with markers telling the true story of what happened in 1889. Not a story about ghosts or hauntings, but a story about religious persecution and the importance of protecting everyone's right to worship freely. I've personally led dozens of families and religious groups up to the mountain. The place feels peaceful now, truly peaceful. Sometimes visitors report hearing faint music on the wind, but it's beautiful music, not frightening. A few have said they felt a sense of welcome and blessing while standing near the old church ruins. I still work as a ranger, but now I also serve as an unofficial chaplain for the memorial site. People come from all over Virginia and beyond to visit Mount Sinai, to learn about its history, and to reflect on the importance of religious tolerance. But I've also noticed other things, changes in myself that I can't entirely explain. Sometimes I wake up with the words to hymns I've never learned running through my head. Occasionally, I find myself speaking with the same old-fashioned accent that Preacher Hartwell used. And once a week, usually on Sunday mornings, I feel a strong compulsion to climb back up to Mount Sinai and hold a simple service at the memorial chapel. Last month, I found something in my ranger station that I can't explain. A leather-bound Bible, printed in 1888, with property of Reverend Samuel Hartwell written inside the front cover. The pages fall open naturally to passages about faith, overcoming persecution, and love conquering hate. I keep the Bible on my desk, and sometimes I read from it when visitors want to know more about the history of the mountain. The words always seem appropriate for whatever questions they're asking. The strangest thing happened just last week. I was leading a group of Methodist ministers up to the memorial site when one of them stopped suddenly near the church ruins. "Did you hear that?" he asked. "Hear what?" I replied. "Someone just said, 'Welcome, brothers, the service is about to begin.'" I listened carefully, but all I heard was the wind through the pine trees. Still, The minister's face was full of peace and wonder, not fear. "This is holy ground," he said quietly. "I can feel it." And he was right. Mount Sinai is holy ground now. Not haunted, not cursed, but blessed. It's a place where faith triumphed over hatred, where love proved stronger than fear, and where the dead found rest through the kindness of the living. If you ever find yourself on a mountain road in Virginia, and you see a sign pointing toward Mount Sinai Memorial Chapel, I encourage you to make the climb. The view is beautiful, the history is important, and you might just experience something that reminds you why faith and tolerance matter. But if you hear singing while you're there, don't be afraid. It just means the mountain remembers, and some memories are worth preserving forever. That's my story, and I'm sticking to it. After all, some things are true whether you believe in them or not, and some stories need to be told, even when they're impossible to prove. Faith works that way sometimes. My name is Prudence Blackthorne, but everyone calls me Prue. I've been a park ranger for 14 years, and I thought I'd seen everything these mountains could throw at me. Bears, wild boar, lost hikers, illegal hunters, you name it. But nothing prepared me for what I found in Witch Gap. I'm not your typical ranger. Got my PhD in anthropology before I ever picked up a badge. My specialty is documenting the old mountain culture, the folk stories, healing traditions, all the knowledge that's disappearing as the old-timers pass on. The Forest Service figured having someone who understood the local culture would help with community relations. They were right, mostly. Witch Gap sits deep in the Pisgah National Forest, about 22 miles from the nearest logging road. You can only reach it by following deer trails and creek beds that the Cherokee used hundreds of years ago. It's a hidden valley tucked between two ridges, with natural springs and the richest soil you've ever seen. The old mountain people called it sacred ground. That's where the trouble started. On May 15, 1995, Dr. Amanda Cole from Appalachian State University called our office, voice shaking like a leaf. Her research team had been studying traditional plant medicine in the area, interviewing the last of the old granny women who still knew which herbs could cure what ailments. Simple stuff, or so we thought. "Ranger Blackthorne," she said, "we need help. Something's happening out here that, well, it shouldn't be possible." I'd worked with Amanda before. She was solid, practical, not given to flights of fancy. If she was spooked, there was good reason. "What kind of something?" I asked. Long pause. "The plants, they're taking care of themselves. Growing in patterns, moving when there's no wind. And the herbs, they're growing stronger than anything we've seen, like they're being tended by expert hands." "Any sign of people living rough out there?" "That's just it," Amanda said. "No human tracks, no camps, no tools. But someone's been working that land. Working it better than any botanist alive." I promised to head out first thing in the morning. Witch Gap was a 3-hour hike through rough country, but I knew the way by heart. My great-grandmother used to tell stories about that place. How the mountain women would gather there during the full moon to collect healing plants and share their knowledge. Of course, that was before the preachers came through in the 1920 seconds, calling them all devil worshippers and witches. That night, I packed my usual gear, first aid kit, radio, camera, notebook for documenting whatever cultural sites Amanda's team might have found. I also threw in some of the old plant guides my great-grandmother had passed down. Hand-drawn pictures of healing herbs with notes in faded mountain dialect. Figured they might come in handy. Should have known better. In these mountains, the past has a way of reaching out and grabbing hold of the present, and sometimes it doesn't let go. The morning dawned clear and cool, perfect hiking weather. I made good time through the forest, following the creek that would lead me to Witch Gap. Everything seemed normal. Birds singing, squirrels chattering, the usual forest sounds. It wasn't until I got within a mile of the gap that things started feeling off. The air smelled different, richer somehow, like someone had been burning sage and lavender, and the plants along the trail looked too healthy, too perfect. Wildflowers blooming out of season, herbs growing in neat little clusters like someone had planted them. I stopped to check my compass, thinking maybe I'd taken a wrong turn. But no, this was the right path. I'd walked it dozens of times. It just felt different now. like the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something. The first thing I noticed when I reached Witch Gap was the garden. It spread across the valley floor in perfect rows and circles, every plant healthy and full. Herbs I recognized from my great-grandmother's drawings: golden seal, bloodroot, wild ginseng, plants that took decades to mature. They grew here like weeds in a vegetable patch. But there was no one around. Amanda's team had cleared out, leaving only their research markers stuck in the ground. Little white flags marking different plant species, all fluttering in a breeze that didn't touch anything else. I called out, voice echoing off the ridge walls. "Amanda? Dr. Cole?" Nothing. Just that weird stillness, like the whole valley was listening. I walked into the garden, and that's when I saw the first impossible thing. The plants moved. Not swaying in the wind. There wasn't any wind down in the valley. They turned toward me like they were tracking my movement. A patch of wild mint actually rustled as I passed, leaves brushing together in a rhythm that sounded almost like whispering. I stopped and pulled out my camera. Through the viewfinder, everything looked normal. Just plants doing plant things. But the second I lowered the camera, there it was again. That subtle movement, like the garden was alive and watching. My radio crackled. Static, then a voice. Female. Speaking in the old mountain dialect my great-grandmother used. "Child, you best be careful where you step. Some of them herbs bite back." I fumbled for the radio. "Hello? Who is this? Amanda?" More static than silence. I looked around the empty valley. My voice came out smaller than I intended. "Is someone there?" That's when I heard the singing. It was faint at first, like wind through the trees, but as I stood there listening, it got clearer. Women's voices, harmonizing in the old way. A song I'd heard my great-grandmother hum while she worked in her own herb garden. Asterisk, "Gather ye herbs in the morning dew." Asterisk, asterisk, "When the moon is full and the sky is true." Asterisk, asterisk, "Speak their names with reverent care." Asterisk, asterisk, "For the old one's wisdom lingers there." Asterisk. The voices came from everywhere and nowhere. I spun around, but the valley was empty except for me and that impossible garden. I found Amanda's notebook under a rock cairn that definitely hadn't been there that morning. Her handwriting was shaky, words scrawled fast, like she was in a hurry. Asterisk, day 3. Plants responding to presence. Growth patterns suggest intelligent cultivation. No human habitation found, but fresh herbal preparations appearing overnight. Well-made medicines using traditional methods none of us know. Mark thinks we're being watched. Vi says the plants are trying to tell us something. I think we should leave. Asterisk. Asterisk, day 4. Mark missing since yesterday evening. Found him this morning by the spring, perfectly healthy but speaking mountain dialect he never learned. Claims he was learning from the grandmothers, refuses to leave, says the old women need him to carry on their work. Asterisk. Asterisk, day 5. This is impossible, but I have to record it. We saw them. Transparent figures in old-style dresses, moving through the garden like they belonged there. They were gathering herbs, preparing medicines with expert hands. When they saw us watching, one smiled and waved, a friendly ghost. Vi tried to approach them, but they faded away like morning mist. Asterisk. The notebook ended there. I looked up from the pages and nearly dropped the book. Standing at the far edge of the garden was a woman in a faded blue dress, gray hair tied back in a kerchief. She was bent over a patch of bloodroot, carefully digging with her bare hands. I blinked hard, thinking it was a trick of the light. When I looked again, she was still there, solid as anything. "Ma'am," I called out. "Are you all right?" She straightened up and turned toward me. Her face was kind but weathered, with eyes that held decades of mountain wisdom. When she smiled, I felt my great-grandmother's presence so strong it made my knees weak. "Well, child," she said in the same voice I'd heard on the radio, "about time someone with sense showed up. These young folks from the college, they mean well, but they don't understand the old ways." I walked toward her, heart hammering. "I'm Ranger Blackthorn. I'm looking for the research team." Blackthorn. She tasted the name like it was familiar. "You wouldn't be kin to Mercy Blackthorn, would you? Sweet girl, had the gift for healing. Lost her too young. My great-grandmother's name. This woman couldn't possibly have known her. Mercy died in 1924, during the Troubles when the preachers came through burning herb gardens and calling the granny women devils. That was my great-grandmother, I whispered. The woman nodded, unsurprised. Thought so. You got her eyes. And her hands. She gestured at my fingers. Good for working with growing things. I looked down at my hands, confused. When I looked up again, the woman was gone. But in the dirt where she'd been digging, someone had left a perfect bundle of bloodroot, tied with dried grass in the old traditional way. Medicine for healing wounds? Mine were just beginning to open. I set up camp that evening in a clearing near the spring, following protocol even though everything about this situation was far from normal. As darkness fell, the garden began to glow. Not electric light, something softer, like moonlight trapped in the plants themselves. Fireflies danced between the herbs in patterns too organized to be natural, spelling out symbols I almost recognized from my great-grandmother's old journals. That's when I heard voices around the fire. I hadn't built a fire, but there it was, crackling merrily in a stone circle that definitely hadn't been there when I made camp. 4 women sat around it, wearing dresses from different eras. One in 1922 style, another in clothes from the 1800s. They were preparing herbs, hands moving with practiced skill as they sorted and bundled plants. "Evening, child," said the oldest one, hair white as fresh snow. "Come sit. We got work to do." My ranger training said, run. Get on the radio, call for backup, report hallucinations brought on by stress or altitude. But my great-grandmother's blood said stay, listen, learn. I sat down on a log that appeared the moment I needed it. "Where's Dr. Cole's team?" I asked. "Safe enough," said the youngest woman, who couldn't have been much older than me when she died. "Mark's learning the proper way to gather ginseng. Takes patience, that one. Vi's got natural talent for the healing arts. She'll make a fine granny woman." "And Dr. Cole?" The women exchanged glances. The oldest one spoke carefully. "Amanda's fighting it. Book learning's made her forget that some knowledge can't be written down, has to be felt in your bones." "Fighting what?" "The calling," said the woman, from the 1922. Her voice held sadness. "Some of us died before we could pass on what we knew. The healing songs, the plant wisdom, the ways of helping folks in need. That knowledge can't just disappear." I thought about my great-grandmother, killed during the religious persecution that swept through these mountains. How many others had died with their knowledge unshared? "So you're teaching Amanda's team?" "Trying to," said the youngest woman. "But they keep fighting it. Think they know better than generations of mountain women. Think their book learning trumps what we learned from our mothers and grandmothers." The fire popped, sending sparks spiraling into the darkness. When I looked back at the women, they were all staring at me. "What about you, child?" asked the oldest. "You willing to listen?" Before I could answer, screaming erupted from somewhere deeper in the valley. I grabbed my flashlight and radio, running toward the sound. The beam cut through darkness that felt thick as syrup. Plants rustled as I passed, and I swear I felt hands, cold, gentle hands, guiding me through the garden. I found Dr. Cole in a clearing surrounded by massive old-growth trees. She was on her knees, hands pressed to her ears, screaming like something was trying to crawl inside her head. "Amanda!" I dropped beside her, checking for injuries. No blood, no visible wounds. But her eyes were wild with terror. "They won't stop," she gasped. "The voices. They want me to remember things I never learned. Healing songs in words I don't know. Plant knowledge that isn't in any book." My radio crackled, that old woman's voice again. "Child's fighting her heritage. Some bloodlines carry the gift, whether they want it or not." I looked at Amanda more carefully. High cheekbones, deep-set eyes, mountain features. "Amanda, where's your family from originally?" "Here," she whispered. "Great-great-grandmother was from these mountains. Family moved away after some trouble in the 1922. The religious persecution. How many families had fled, taking their daughters away from the traditional knowledge that had been passed down for generations. "They're not trying to hurt you," I said, understanding flooding through me. "They're trying to give you back what was taken from your family." Amanda looked up at me, tears streaming down her face. "It hurts. There's so much, and I don't understand any of it." That's when I saw Vi and Mark emerge from the tree line. But they weren't quite right. Vi moved with an old woman's careful gait despite being barely 30. Mark's face held a serenity that didn't match his usual nervous energy. "Evening, Prue," Vi said in a voice that carried a mountain accent she'd never had before. "Thought you might be needing some help with Amanda here." Mark nodded, hands stained green from plant work. "The grandmothers say she's got the strongest gift of any of us. But gifts like that, they can tear a person apart if they fight too hard." I realized with growing horror that my missing researchers weren't missing at all. They were being transformed. And I was next. The fire behind us blazed higher, though no one had added wood. In its light, I could see dozens of figures moving through the garden. Women in old-style dresses, tending plants with supernatural skill. An entire community of the dead, working to preserve knowledge that the living had forgotten or abandoned. My radio crackled one last time before the battery died. "Your turn, child. Time to come home." The truth hit me like a cold mountain spring to the face. The phantom granny women weren't just preserving plant knowledge, they were preserving themselves. Each time they recruited a living person, taught them the old ways, that person became part of their eternal community. Mark and Vi weren't my colleagues anymore. They were ghosts in training. "We have to get out of here," I told Amanda, pulling her to her feet. "Now." But Mark stepped in front of us, and for a moment his face flickered, showing something older underneath. Much older. "Can't leave yet," he said in a voice that belonged to someone else. "Haven't learned what you came to learn." The garden around us blazed with spectral light. Everywhere I looked, transparent women worked among the herbs, their hands weaving patterns in the air that made the plants grow stronger, healthier, more potent than anything that should exist in nature. "Look at what we've accomplished," Vi said, gesturing at the impossible abundance around us. "Medicines that could heal anything. Knowledge that could save lives. The old ways aren't dead. They're just waiting for the right people to carry them forward." I understood now why the phantom women had called me here specifically. My last name, Blackthorn. My great-grandmother's gift for healing. The blood connection that made me sensitive to their presence. The oldest granny woman materialized beside the dying fire, her form more solid than before. "Child, your great-grandmother died before she could teach you properly. Let us finish what she started." She held out her hands, palms up. In them, I could see my entire heritage spread out like a map. Generations of mountain women, each one adding to the store of healing knowledge. Plant wisdom passed from mother to daughter, healing songs that could cure ailments modern medicine couldn't touch, protective charms that actually worked. All of it lost when the preachers came through, calling them devils and witches. "We're not evil," the old woman said, reading my thoughts. "We're the last guardians of knowledge that could heal the world, but we need living hands to do the work." I felt the pull then. Not magical compulsion, but something deeper. The calling of blood to blood, knowledge seeking knowledge. Part of me wanted to take her hands, to learn everything she had to teach, to become part of something larger than myself. But Amanda was still screaming. I looked at her, really looked, and saw what the forced knowledge transfer was doing. Her eyes were bloodshot, tears of blood running down her cheeks. Her hands shook uncontrollably as plant knowledge poured into her mind faster than she could process it. "You're killing her," I said. "Transforming her," Vi corrected. "Same as us. Same as you plan to do to me." The oldest granny woman's expression grew sad. "We don't have choice in the matter, child. Knowledge this important can't be allowed to die. If we have to take unwilling students to preserve it, well," she shrugged, "greater good and all." That's when I understood the true horror of Witch Gap. These women had died protecting their knowledge from religious persecution, but in death, they'd become just as rigid and controlling as the preachers who'd killed them. They were forcing their gifts on people who couldn't handle them, creating an eternal community of the unwilling dead. "My great-grandmother wouldn't have wanted this," I said. The old woman's face hardened. "Your great-grandmother died before her work was finished. We're finishing it for her." I backed away, pulling Amanda with me. But everywhere I turned, more phantom women appeared. Dozens of them, surrounding us in a circle of supernatural intent. All of them reaching out with translucent hands, ready to pour centuries of plant knowledge into our living minds. "There has to be another way," I said desperately. "Is there?" asked the youngest ghost, stepping forward. "You think the outside world is ready to accept what we know? They'll call us witches same as before. Burn our gardens, destroy our work. At least here, in death, our knowledge stays safe. Looking around at the incredible garden, the perfect herbs, the medicines that could cure anything, I realized she was right about one thing. The outside world would never accept this. But that didn't mean it had to stay trapped in a valley full of ghosts. I thought about my position as a park ranger, my academic credentials, my connections with the university system. Maybe there was a way to preserve the knowledge without trapping people's souls. What if I could promise you something better? I said. What if I could make sure your knowledge survives and gets passed on properly, without forcing anyone to become ghosts? The phantom women paused, their reaching hands freezing in midair. Speak your piece, said the oldest one. Let me establish a protected preserve, official recognition for traditional plant knowledge, academic programs that respect the old ways without exploiting them, a place where people can learn voluntarily, at their own pace. And if they don't listen? I thought about Amanda bleeding from her eyes, about Mark and Vi becoming hollow shells filled with someone else's knowledge, about my great-grandmother dying young because she couldn't share what she knew. Then at least you'll have tried to do it right, without becoming the same kind of oppressors who killed you in the first place. The words hung in the air like smoke from the dying fire. For a long moment, the only sound was Amanda's ragged breathing and the whisper of wind through herbs that shouldn't exist. Then the oldest granny woman smiled, really smiled, for the first time since I'd seen her. Smart girl, she said, just like your great-grandmother. The phantoms didn't just disappear. They faded slowly, like morning mist burning off under sunlight. But before they left, each one touched my forehead with gossamer fingers, not forcing knowledge into my mind, but offering it. Generations of plant wisdom flowing gently into my consciousness, settling into my memory like seeds waiting for the right season to grow. I would remember everything they had to teach, but I would learn it at my own pace, in my own way. Amanda collapsed as the forced knowledge transfer ended, but she was breathing normally again. The blood tears had stopped. Mark and Vi blinked like people waking from long dreams, confusion replacing the otherworldly serenity in their faces. What happened? Vi asked, her regular accent restored. You learned something important, I said. But the lesson's over now. We hiked out of Witch Gap the next morning. The impossible garden was still there, but it looked more natural now. Still abundant, still perfectly tended, but in a way that wouldn't make botanists weep with confusion. I kept my promise. It took 6 months of paperwork, political maneuvering, and calling in every favor I'd built up over 14 years of service. But Witch Gap became the Appalachian Traditional Knowledge Preserve, the first officially protected site for traditional plant medicine in the National Forest System. We established partnerships with 3 universities, bringing in ethnobotanists who understood the cultural significance of what they were studying, not exploiting the knowledge, but learning it properly. Respectfully, Amanda leads the program now. Turns out she has a natural gift for traditional plant medicine, when it's not being forced into her head by desperate ghosts. Mark documents the oral histories. Vi teaches workshops on sustainable herb gathering, and I serve as the preserve's cultural liaison, making sure the academic world respects what the mountain people always knew. Sometimes, when I'm working in the preserve's teaching garden, I feel them watching, not the desperate, grasping phantoms from that terrifying night, but peaceful spirits who know their knowledge is safe. My great-grandmother among them, finally able to rest now that her teachings have found worthy hands to carry them forward. I still find things in my quarters sometimes, fresh herbal preparations I didn't make, protective charms woven from plants I'm still learning to identify. Gifts from teachers who no longer need to trap students to share their wisdom. The preserve has become something special, a place where traditional knowledge and modern science work together instead of fighting. Other sites are being identified throughout Appalachian region, places where the old wisdom was so strong it left echoes that still resonate today. We're careful about who we bring to Witch Gap. Some knowledge is powerful enough to change people, and not everyone is ready for that kind of transformation. But for those who are called to it, really called, not forced, it's become a place of genuine healing. The garden still grows with supernatural abundance, but now it's tended by living hands that chose to be there, guided by wisdom that's been freely given instead of desperately hoarded. That's the difference between preservation and possession, between honoring the past and being trapped by it. The granny women finally learned the lesson their persecutors never could. Real knowledge can't be forced. It has to be offered freely and accepted willingly, or it becomes just another form of violence. In my desk drawer, I keep the last thing they left me. A piece of paper, written in my great-grandmother's handwriting. Asterisk, thank you for finishing what I started. The old ways live on. Asterisk, sometimes, when the moon is full and the herbs are ready for gathering, I hear them singing again. But now it's a song of joy instead of desperate longing. The sound of wisdom finally free to be what it was always meant to be. A gift shared between generations, not a chain binding the dead to the living. The mountains remember everything, good and bad, but in Witch Gap, they're finally starting to heal.